To be alone forever. Some people's greatest fear. A table for one at a fancy restaurant, falling asleep in a cold bed, a quiet, empty house. With no one to share your wins and losses with, no one to witness your happiest moments or comfort you in your most difficult ones. It's that sinking feeling in your chest, imagining that you're unlovable and undesirable and fearing you might remain that way forever. If you're single, there's a high likelihood that you've felt this way before, and if you have, there's no reason to be ashamed of it. It's normal, or dare I say expected, that you'd feel this way in a world obsessed with romantic partnerships. These fears are echoed everywhere, in the movies we watch, the songs we listen to, and even in social and political discussions. One of the first insults you hear thrown around is, "You'll never find love thinking this way." Unfortunately, this is why many people enter and stay in relationships that might not be the best, because we have this notion that being with anyone is better than being alone. But what if we could change our thinking about being single and focus more on the positive aspects of it? Here is why you should stay single. Embracing life without a romantic partner isn't easy, but if you do the work and are honest and intentional with yourself, you can create a great life for yourself. You can find happiness on your own, and for many of us, it's easier than finding the right partner. The first thing to remember is that being single isn't the same as being alone or lonely. You can be romantically single and still have fulfilling relationships with family and friends. Sharing your life with the people you love doesn't necessarily have to involve romance. There's this unspoken expectation that our romantic partners have to be our everything. They need to be our best friends, counselors, caregivers, and providers. These necessary roles can easily be filled by multiple people in our lives. You could even argue that spreading your support network across multiple people is better. It's unrealistic to think that one person can fulfill your every need and desire. In fact, this is one of the reasons a lot of relationships end. One party feels so burdened by all the emotional weight in the relationship that they burn out. By learning to share these roles and expanding your support network, you're better prepared for the difficulties in life. You're also less likely to feel lonely because you have more people to lean on. Even if your relationship with one person is suffering, you have others to turn to. This is why so many people are lonely, even people in relationships. Because they put all of their expectations on one person, they start to feel alienated and alone when those expectations are not being met. This dynamic of being alone with a partner can cut deeper than the loneliness you feel when you're single. Because in a partnership, you're not supposed to feel lonely. So adding to your loneliness is the shame and the guilt of feeling lonely in the first place. It's also difficult to share this feeling with others. Friends and family might have difficulty believing you because they see the snippets of life with your partner. So they remind you of the good times and tell you that all relationships require hard work, because it's commonly believed that being lonely together is better than being alone. Many people stay in relationships that they should leave because they're afraid of being single. And if more people had a positive view of single life, I think the pressure to stay in unhappy relationships would decrease. Being in a relationship doesn't mean you'll become your best self, but this still seems to be the way of life we're pressured to conform to. Romance is the central theme of countless Hollywood blockbusters, novels, and TV shows. We're constantly being sold the idea that love will complete us, that we're nothing on our own. We're taught to look for our better half as if we can't be whole on our own. Even apart from the stories sold to us by the media, society also seems to favor people who are in couples. Practically, life is just so much cheaper when you have someone to split the rent and groceries with. Healthcare plans and travel expenses privilege couples, and setting money aside, a spouse or a common law partner holds a certain status in your life, like an extension of yourself. Your partner holds the title of someone who knows you better than anyone else, even if you have a friend or family member who might be worthy of that role. Friends and family might see your life as incomplete without a special someone. Everything could be going right for you, but without a partner, you might be pitied and seen as a failure. The people in your life could be trying to influence you to find someone, making you feel that being alone is an inferior option. And after a while, you believe it's what you should do. But it doesn't have to be this way. There are lots of ways to live a happy life, and it's important to know what it feels like to live a happy life on your own. While it is true that the world isn't set up to support single people, there are huge benefits to spending life on your own. When you're single, you have complete control over your life choices. Want to move to a new city or change careers? You can fully pivot the direction of your life without having to consider the needs or wants of a partner. You can take risks without fear that your choices will negatively impact someone else. You don't have to feel guilty about going after what you truly want, because ultimately, the only person you have to consider is yourself. It extends to little things like decorating your house, what time you want to wake up in the morning, and what you eat for dinner. While these sound like small luxuries, this kind of freedom and independence doesn't come easy with a partner, even with active communication. When you're single, everything in your life is entirely in your control, and this might sound daunting. Some people prefer being told what to do. It's why a lot of people are stuck in codependent relationships that they can't get out of. But being single forces you to work through any of the issues of dependency you might have. The control you gain over your life allows you to develop a sense of self and to figure out who you really are and what you want out of life. As an adult, singleness is the first time you get this opportunity. As a child, choices were made for you, and as a young adult, the school system controls most of your waking hours. If you're ushered straight from that phase into a series of relationships, you'll never really know what it feels like to live life uninfluenced. While some might be fine with this, I think it can stunt your growth. As an independent adult, you have the chance to get to know who you are when no one's watching, and you gain trust in your ability to make the right choices for yourself. Don't deny yourself the opportunity of self-discovery. An extended period of your life, free from any notion of romance, can help you tune into your emotional side. You learn what it feels like to listen to yourself without the distraction of outside noise that a partner often brings. You can hear what you want and follow through on your desires. When you become good at listening to yourself, you can begin to live a life that aligns with your own values. You learn how to soothe yourself in times of stress, take care of yourself, and enjoy your own company. And it sounds easy, right? Well, being single definitely also has its downsides. I don't want to paint a romanticized version of being single because that would be ironic. You see, even with the best friends and family, being single can still be lonely. Your friends and family have other people they're devoted to, and because you're not in a romantic relationship with them, they don't owe you first priority in their lives. You might want to vent to someone after a rough day at work and find that your friends are too busy and can't meet up. Managing chores and life tasks all on your own can be a challenge. Then there's the emotional and physical intimacy that most of us crave, even if only occasionally. Someone to buy you flowers or just make a cup of coffee for you in the morning. Also, in a partnership, it can be easy to blame your problems on another person. When you're single, there is no place to hide. You have to take responsibility for your life, the good and the bad. And if something is happening that's making you miserable, then you are the one who needs to change it. The difficulties of living alone can be so intense that they sometimes lead people to turn towards unsatisfactory relationships. Scrolling through dating apps trying to find the next first date, finding comfort in awkward situationships, or constantly seeking casual sex can all be coping mechanisms for starving off loneliness. Of course, finding yourself in strange, unfulfilling romantic entanglements isn't the end of the world, and each case is specific. But using other people to shield or distract ourselves from our insecurities and problems is easy. It helps us avoid looking deep within ourselves and investigating our dependent behavior. I think intentional singleness requires a lot of courage. It shows you're willing to plunge into the depths of yourself without fear of what you'll find. It can be seen as an act of self-love. You're willing to be your own company, spend time with yourself, and let your thoughts and actions guide the trajectory of your life. Your sense of worth, desirability, and validation has to come within. You can't fast-track this work through a month or two of being single between relationships. It might take years of singleness to realize that you're better off on your own, or prefer to be alone rather than with someone you don't like. You might even arrive at a place where you prefer to remain single forever, but this time it doesn't come with a sinking feeling of despair, but with excitement and a sense of liberation. If you're currently in a loving romantic relationships, don't take this as a reason to break up with them. Being in a relationship has its merits, and what you want from life is different for everyone. And I can't deny that dating can be fun, and every relationship you have is an opportunity to learn more about yourself, albeit through the lens of somebody else. Plus, you could fall in love and find the perfect partner that feels like they complete you and spend the rest of your life with them, because truly there is no template to this life. Remember that staying single for a while doesn't completely mean ignoring your desire for a relationship one day. Instead, it's an opportunity to find satisfaction despite that desire. It's about recognizing who you can be when you're alone and the type of person who could complement you. Who you are is special and worth protecting, and after a season of being alone, you'll more likely value yourself and your time. You'll know that it's only worth being in a relationship if it supports who you truly are, and if not, you'll have the confidence that you can remain alone. True compatibility is hard to find, and the mysteries of attraction are far too complex to dive into here, but after spending some time on your own, what if you do meet someone who adds to what you've built for yourself? that can acknowledge and love the person you've become when no one's watching. How can you deny yourself that? To be single doesn't mean you have to stay single forever if that isn't something you want. It's a chance to get to know yourself better, learn the value of your time and who you really are. It's about recognizing that you shouldn't just throw yourself at anyone for the sake of companionship, but it's also about not getting too tied up in yourself that you close yourself off from any real chance at love. Finding happiness on your own is important, but sharing happiness with another person could also be important. A saying goes, happiness held is the seed, happiness shared is the flower. Don't get so caught up in your single life that you find yourself clutching the seed in your fist with a death grip. When the right person comes along, open your hand and invite them into your world, and don't be afraid to spend some time in theirs too. If what you've built is stable, you can always return, and that confidence is what makes the best relationships. Only when you spent time nurturing your seed of happiness will it be ready to bloom when someone comes along to water it. Love is a truly complex thing. Watch this next video to find out all about it. You've just graduated college and worked your first month at your new job. You've worked extremely hard to get this position, and getting that first paycheck feels like such a triumphant moment. The possibilities of what you can do with your income are exciting. This is the first time you've had a sense of freedom over the money you've earned, but the sad truth is, you don't have any freedom, and that reality becomes clear when you open a letter you receive in the mail a few days later. It's from a student loan program informing you of your repayment schedule. This paycheck never really was yours. You owe money, you're in debt, and will be in debt for a very long time. And once the realization sets in, every coffee purchased or drink with a friend suddenly starts to feel like you're splurging with someone else's money. It makes you feel guilty and sometimes even depressed. This is the story of around 1 in 5 American adults who have student loan debt, but in reality, this isn't your fault. It's just one of the ways that governments and banks might be keeping you poor. Before continuing, I should clarify that not all debt is bad. It can give people opportunities that they might not have had otherwise. It allows startups to get off the ground without using personal capital, and it allows people to make big purchases that can be paid off in smaller chunks spread over a long period of time. But too much debt and lousy interest rates can cause severe problems. Studies suggest that being in debt can make you more anxious, depressed, and cause many people to experience suicidal thoughts. You might feel okay with how much you owe right now, but these mental health issues can grow bigger as your debt gets higher. Debt also makes your future feel limited. Your ability to travel, make big purchases, and move on to another phase of life is greatly challenged by the amount of money you owe. For instance, you can't get a mortgage if you have too much student debt. Debt can impact your relationships and health, and there are studies linking bad debt ratios to high blood pressure and higher rates of divorce. It goes back to that feeling of splurging on something using someone else's money. This feeling puts a spotlight on spending habits within a relationship, causing stress, arguments, and separation. You don't need to be a gambling addict to have fights over money. You might think it's okay to incur debt because when you die, it dies with you, but this isn't always the truth. A lot of different debts can be inherited by your loved ones, especially debts you've taken on with another person, like mortgage. Being in debt isn't great, but don't be too hard on yourself because it's not necessarily your fault. We live in a society that has institutionalized debt and has made borrowing a living commonplace. Think about it, we're encouraging young kids barely old enough to vote to take on thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars of loans just to get an education. We all know how terrible these loans can be, but one effect we don't really talk about is how they tend to normalize the idea of taking on debt to people who are just entering adulthood. This creates a mindset about money that takes a very long time to shake, even if it's possible to shake it all. A student who has a lot of loans to repay may also experience debt fatalism, a state where being in debt seems inescapable. If you're accustomed to existing in debt, it's difficult to picture what it's like to exist without it, and as a result, you're more likely to continue drowning in it. When people think of debt, there's often the stigma that it's the individual's fault. You hear finance gurus tell you about wasteful people who splurge on the latest iPhone and buy Starbucks every day instead of making coffee at home. And while there are certainly people who are responsible with credit, the reality is that most people who are in debt are there out of necessity. For one, people with children are far more likely to incur debt from the cost of taking care of a child. The same goes for people who have to take care of a parent. These two factors introduce a variety of necessary expenses that no amount of penny pinching will mitigate. Most people's financial literacy is also very poor. It's a subject that's seldom taught in schools, so we're often at the mercy of the lenders and the fine print that we don't bother to read. Even if we did take the time to read the terms and conditions while applying for a new credit card, would we even understand them? All of this without even talking about the system whose entire existence depends on debt: banks. Let's take a moment to look at how banks work. You give them money, 90% of that money is lent to someone else. The person taking the loan puts it in their account, and 90% of that amount is loaned to someone else, and so on. The bank charges interest on all those loans that were made possible thanks to your money. Debt is how they make money. It's the core of their business model. To make matters worse, banks are profit-driven and often use predatory practices to try and get you to incur more debt, because their favorite clients aren't the ones who pay off their debt as quickly as possible, but the ones they refer to as revolvers, people who are perpetually in debt. Banks know your income and they know what you can't afford, but that doesn't seem to stop them from issuing you multiple credit cards or locking you into a high-interest loan. These are companies that pursue profits over the well-being of their clients. Imagine having several maxed-out credit cards and then piling on multiple high-interest loans until you can no longer afford the minimum payment on any of them. Where else can you go? Remember that dark road we talked about earlier? Well, that road can lead to someone taking their own life. This is what's known as debt suicide. People find themselves drowning in debt and feel like there's no other way to escape it. People in debt are 3 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts, and similarly, people who die from suicide are 8 times more likely to be in debt. Sure, you can say that ultimately the individual is responsible, but what about the corporations that nudge, push, and deceive these people into making poor financial decisions? What responsibility should they bear in all of this? Credit card companies, for example, will often use deceitful tactics like charging 0% interest for the first 6 months to try and get people accustomed to not paying off their credit cards. Then, when the high interest kicks in, there's a good chance the cardholder has already accumulated a ton of debt. Strategies like this are designed to nudge more and more people down the dark path, keeping them poor. It's how banks and credit card companies make more money. It's in the pursuit of bigger profits. They knowingly neglect the welfare of their clients. This can sometimes mean that the parents can afford to give their kids a decent start to life, or that the kids can afford to give their parents a decent end to life. These are the real consequences. We're destroying the lives of the common people to fill the pockets of the few at the top. These shady companies are on one side of the institutional debt equation. On the other side is what we need all that loan money for in the first place. The 2 biggest expenses in life of an average person in the US are an education and a home. And in the last 50 years, the cost of both have skyrocketed, far outpacing inflation. To what many would consider a good life with a home they own and a good education, most people either have to come from wealth or incur enormous debt. But why has college and university tuition risen so much? A main culprit in the US is the reduction of state funding for these schools. For the last 30 years, colleges have been a primary target for governments to cut costs, especially during recessions. This reduction has caused colleges to operate more like businesses to earn the money they need to stay afloat. But the unintended consequences of schools operating like businesses is that they are now more focused on competing aggressively with each other and trying to make the most profits, instead of focusing on the welfare of the students. This means that pursuing star professors and researchers with higher wages, keeping class sizes lower to be more attractive to potential applicants, and introducing a lot more extracurriculars to attract students, even though they might be an unnecessary expense, that only increases tuitions further. There's no central mechanism in the United States to control the cost of higher education. The country does give students a fair amount of financial aid, but much of the country's college tuition is paid for through loan programs. In neighboring Canada, tuition has also risen a lot in the same period, even though it's more significantly subsidized for citizens. The problem remains that students across North America are paying a lot more for post-secondary education than they were before, and it's happening on the government's watch. But there's a much bigger cause of debt that has also exploded in cost in the last 30 years: housing. The reason why housing is so expensive now is complicated. I'd love to write it off as greed, but that wouldn't be telling the full story. One of the main causes of housing's high cost is government regulation, but it's not quite what you think. Regulations are important. There's environmental impact analysis, soil sampling, and numerous other approvals that need to be acquired before a developer can break new ground. These are necessary but expensive steps that need to be taken today that wouldn't have been done 30 or more years ago, and it's great that we're doing them now. But there are other unnecessary regulations that aren't driven by human and environmental needs. These are housing density regulations, and they have a big impact on house prices. Housing exists in a system of supply and demand. More supply typically results in lower cost. A great way to increase the housing supply is to build higher density housing, like apartment buildings, but In many cities and towns across North America, regulations are preventing higher density housing from being built. And these regulations are often influenced by current homeowners who want their homes to remain at sky-high value. When high-density condominium buildings do get built in great numbers, there are still some other factors that can prevent home prices from falling. In Toronto, for example, developers build large luxury condos, ones that sell at a premium price. These condos wouldn't sell very well at those prices if not for a second factor that's keeping prices high: investment homes. These are homes that wealthy people buy up as investments, reducing the local supply and therefore increasing the value of these homes. Many luxury condos are purchased as investments only, leaving many of them sitting empty, even during a housing crisis. Governments have done little to intervene in investment housing and have instead prohibited solutions like higher density housing. Blame is often passed between levels of government, with local, state, provincial, and federal bodies blaming each other and kicking the can further down the road. And the result is that home ownership becomes an enormous source of debt for some people and not even a remote possibility for others. And there's no escape from this problem by simply renting either. The cost of rent has also skyrocketed as a consequence of higher housing prices, further leading into even more debt. Another problem for renters is when the companies buy existing buildings, give them a luxury renovation, and then jack up the price of rent. No new homes are built in this scenario, and the average price of a home and rent still goes up. The question of personal responsibility for debt doesn't seem so significant when you see how banks and governments are making increasingly larger debt loads inescapable. Debt is painful, and it seems like our largest institutions are too invested in profiting from it to make it easier on the average person. For now, we can make sure to not take on unnecessary debts and be sure to read the fine print when we do need to take out a loan. The truth is that governments can do a whole lot more to help their poorest citizens. The video on screen right now will show you how the richest man who ever lived did exactly that for his citizens. In May of 2023, Ivan Toney, an English soccer player who plays for Brentford Football Club in the English Premier League, was banned from soccer for 8 months and fined $62,500 after being found guilty of 232 breaches of the Football Association's betting rules. It's easy to write off his story as an individual failure on Ivan Toney's part, and while he is undoubtedly at fault and has been rightfully punished, the situation highlights a more significant problem with sports betting as a whole and how it's destroying young men. In 2012, American rapper 50 Cent bet $500,000 that the New York Giants would win the National Football Conference title. They did, and he won over $1 million. Not only did that bet elevate him in the eyes of the gambling elite, but it created a dream for young men everywhere: the dream of the winning bet. Today, that dream has been democratized through a seemingly endless stream of sports betting apps. The companies will sell you on the idea that, just like 50 Cent, you too can become a millionaire by placing the right bet on the game you love. Unfortunately, this easy access to gambling has opened the floodgates to a new public health and addiction crisis around the globe. And with major industries behind it, it's hard to imagine this epidemic ending anytime soon. One of these industries is the American National Football League, the NFL. In 2012, the same year that 50 Cent won his big bet, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell said that gambling was a threat to the league. And just over a decade since he made that statement, the 2023 Super Bowl was riddled with ads from major sportsbook companies like FanDuel and DraftKings. Did Goodell genuinely have a change of heart about betting, or were there just too many under-the-desk handshakes for him to keep his stance? We may never know for sure, but what's clear for all to see though, is that all the major sports leagues and the networks that license them now work together with casinos and gambling apps through multi-million-dollar partnerships. Announcers identify moments to place a bet as they're calling the game, and pre-game TV segments are devoted to analyzing betting odds. And it's not just in the US. The second tier of the English Football League pyramid is sponsored by a betting company. The competition is literally called the Sky Bet Championship. Look at this photograph of Ivan Toney, the footballer I mentioned earlier. See anything striking? Check out the logo on his jersey. It's for a sports betting company called Hollywood Bets. So the club he plays for is sponsored by a betting company. And that's just the biggest irony. And it's not just Brentford. Around 40% of shirt sponsors for clubs in the 2022 or 2023 Premier League were gambling companies. And as if sporting competitions and teams endorsing gambling aren't problematic enough, colleges filled with students who are too young to gamble are also jumping into bed with sportsbook apps. Representatives from these online gambling companies go to campuses to discuss their products and offer promotions, and it mimics the transition that happened years ago when universities in the US accepted beer and liquor partners at sporting events. These companies hide behind legality as a defense against criticism, and the argument is that legal sports betting apps are always safer than gambling on the black market with untrustworthy bookies. So if college kids are going to gamble anyway, isn't it better they do so legally and safely? But the truth is only a tiny fraction of the students at these schools are even old enough to legally drink or gamble in the first place. While the argument makes some sense, the problem isn't really the legality of gambling, it's the aggressive marketing of the betting companies and their target audience. 1 in 5 American adults say they've bet money on sports in the last 12 months. In 2022, revenue from sports betting was around $75 billion, a 75% increase from 2021, and over 100 million legal Super Bowl 2023 transactions were recorded, a 25% increase from the previous year. The group most affected by this rapid rise in sports betting? Young men. It's a known scientific fact that young people are more predisposed to addiction. Telling avid young sports fans that they can make money through betting is extremely dangerous and unethical when you know that they have a higher chance of getting addicted than they do of winning anything. Gambling addicts have higher rates of depression and suicidal behavior than the rest of the population. As many as 19% of gambling addicts attempt suicide, the highest rate of any addiction. And another problem with sports gambling is that it's often an unseen addiction. When we think of gambling, we often picture rolling dice or shuffling cards, things that we perceive as having a random outcome, games of chance. But sports betting is different. Bettors are convinced that their choices are informed. After all, they've been following the sport since they were a kid, so they might consider themselves experts, giving themselves the illusion of control over the bets they place compared to traditional gambling. Some of these young men even turn to social media influencers for betting advice, not knowing that many of these self-proclaimed betting experts are scam artists looking to cash in on their followers. Sadly, the constant flow of sports betting information on platforms like Twitter and YouTube, together with the aggressive marketing of these betting companies, is driving people to bet higher and more frequently. People think they're making smart moves based on data when in reality they're still more likely to lose than they are to win. New Jersey was one of the first states in the US to legalize gambling. When they did, they increased funding for gathering data on every bet placed and for conducting regular studies on the industry as a whole. Records show that approximately 70% of all sports bets placed to lose. That's an incredibly high number for an industry that promises data-driven odds. What makes sports betting addiction even more invisible is the fact that unlike alcohol or drugs, the warning signs might not be that obvious. The physical toll isn't as noticeable, and it's not until things get very, very bad that family and friends might start to piece together what's going on. It'll often start with joining a harmless fantasy sports league or placing a small bet on a single outcome, but once someone realizes they have access to unlimited betting in the palm of their hands, things can quickly get out of control. Because gamblers are able to gamble anywhere at any time through their smartphones, they could be sitting next to their spouse, roommate, or kids who have no idea that their loved one is gambling away all their life savings. Some of these new apps even connect directly to your bank account, making it easy to lose track of how much you're betting and losing. And since it's not a conventional addiction, few people seek help compared with other mental health disorders or physical addictions. When they do, there's also a high discontinuation of treatment. 39% of people who seek treatment will drop out before completing recovery, compared to a 20% dropout rate for other mental health issues. Like any addiction, there are treatment options, but recovering from a gambling addiction is particularly difficult because the drug of choice is with you at all times, on your phone. Therapists treating the addiction ask patients to stop using smartphones or even stop watching sports, and the sportsbook companies themselves don't make it easier for those addicted to quit. Cool-off functions on betting apps that block users from gambling for a few hours or days aren't easily accessible. Same with self-exclusion options that users can use to block themselves from the app for long periods of time. Unsurprisingly, the American Gaming Association, which lobbies to bolster and promote the gambling industry, insists that these self-imposed limits do exist, even though they're difficult to find. The association is also quick to note that it's the largest funder of recovery services as part of its commitment to promote responsible gambling. And it's not lying, but isn't that just taking 2 steps back and 1 step forward? That's still 1 step back. The focus in the US on gambling disorders has been minimal. Resources for addicts have been stretched thin during this current wave of betting. Calls to gambling hotlines in 2021 rose 43% over 2020, hotline texts increased 59%, and chats increased 84%. Yet at the same exact time, we're seeing a massive increase in advertising by online sportsbook companies. In 2022, in the United States alone, ad spending on sports betting was close to $1.8 billion. These ads promote misleading, risk-free bets and other perks that make an incredibly risky behavior seem not so risky. And it doesn't help that the ads are produced to glamorize gambling. They're wholesome and aspirational, showing people the lifestyle that they could have with all the money they'll win gambling. And they offer quick, confusing disclaimers that, like the side effects of a prescription drug, are difficult to see or hear. And of course these ads have led to record-breaking revenue for gambling companies. The terrifying part of this entire thing is that we're fully aware of the risks associated with sports betting. Just look at New Jersey, the first state to legalize gambling after a US Supreme Court ruling in 2018 left the decision of legalization to the states. Today, New Jersey has 3 times the national average of gambling addicts. Around 13% of the state's population suffers from a gambling problem. With this grim reality, why aren't we all clamoring for a ban or at least moderation of sports betting? To be fair, many of the remaining states where gambling is still illegal are in no rush to legalize it, and like with any trend, as the population adapts to the availability of legal sports gambling, its popularity may decrease. But we don't need to rely on potential outcomes to begin making a dent in solving the problem for the millions of Americans susceptible to gambling addiction. The app should set time and money limits, especially for their younger users. They should also fund public service announcements on television and social media about gambling addictions. In Australia, a country whose population has struggled with sports betting, live sports gambling isn't available online. Bets must be placed by phone or at a designated venue, which allows staff to intervene if they see the signs of addiction. In the UK, the government has banned all top athletes and celebrities from appearing in ads that endorse or promote gambling, and all 20 clubs in the English Premier League have agreed that they will no longer place gambling sponsorships on their matchday shirts starting at the beginning of the 2026-2027 season. The US needs to learn from and implement some of these measures because currently, federal oversight of legal online gambling is virtually non-existent. There's no federal funds designated for the treatment or research of gambling addiction, unlike tobacco, drugs, and alcohol, which all have federal support towards recovery efforts. And beyond the federal government, there's an unclear patchwork of state legislation and consumer protections. The American Gaming Association has created a responsible marketing code to set industry-wide advertising standards, but that's like asking cigarette companies in the 1950s to self-regulate the Marlboro Man. We need to see the same sanctions that were implemented on tobacco applied to the sports betting industry. One study showed that the tobacco industry wanted people hooked on a deadly product. The US Food and Drug Administration immediately limited advertising. To this day, it's impossible to buy cigarettes without being confronted with a dramatic label warning about their health implications. So why do we treat those who are susceptible to gambling addiction any differently? The science behind gambling addiction doesn't differ too much from being addicted to tobacco or even cocaine. Just as cigarettes can harm your physical health, sports betting has the potential to ruin families and lead to lifelong mental health struggles. As the government lags behind, gambling companies, sports leagues, and anyone else who can profit off of unwitting bettors rake in cash while our young men are being destroyed by the addiction. We're still in the early days of rampant sports betting, and it couldn't have come at a more dangerous time because of some of the people placing bets on sports aren't doing it for the love of the game, they're doing it for survival. With a depressed stock market, some people think sports betting is a better way to invest their money than buying stocks. Times are volatile, the financial markets are uncertain, and people are desperate. But the sad reality is that people who think they can find some sort of upside in sports betting will likely end up disappointed. Or worse. Wake up to the sound of the alarm on your iPhone, and annoyed that you couldn't get more sleep, you grudgingly unlock your phone to see what's going on in the world. And there's an email from Amazon telling you that your package has been delivered. So you force yourself out of bed to get the package, and it's some Johnson & Johnson medicine you ordered the night before. The wonders of overnight shipping, you think to yourself. You glance across the room to see the clock. It's 8 a.m. and you have to be at work by 9. Flustered, you open your Microsoft computer to answer some work emails before getting dressed. There's no time to cook breakfast, so you'll just grab something at McDonald's on your way to work. What if I told you that every single company you just interacted with within the first hour of your day is heavily influenced in large part by one company? BlackRock. Now, I'm sure you've heard about BlackRock. There are dozens of videos here on YouTube that talk about how it's the company that controls the entire world. But the reality is far less glamorous. Here is why everything you've heard about BlackRock is wrong. Before we talk about that, let's talk about data. Every time we browse on the internet, companies collect an insane amount of data from us, information which is then sold to data brokers, who in turn sell it to the highest bidder or just lose that information in data breaches. According to a report from the Identity Theft Resource Center, there were 68% more breaches in 2021 than in 2020, and that number is only going up. BlackRock is an investment firm that controls a huge number of shares in some of the largest companies in the world. They have a total of $10 trillion in assets across the globe. That's an amount equal to half of America's total GDP, controlled just by one company. It's easy to dismiss such a powerful company as all-out evil, but the truth is, BlackRock doesn't own these companies or even own shares of these companies. Their clients own the shares, BlackRock simply manages them. That's not to say that BlackRock doesn't have any influence on these companies, they definitely do. Because they control such an incredible amount of their stock, it's possible that companies want to keep in BlackRock's good graces, so they don't pull their investments. Now, while BlackRock might not be the evil company some people make them out to be, the truth is, there's still something very shady about them. Their hypocrisy. BlackRock was founded 34 years ago by Larry Fink, and he grew the company from $5 million in value to $8 billion in just 5 years, primarily by managing money invested by large institutions like pensions, university endowments, and substantial fortunes invested by the uber-rich. Today, Fink serves on the Council on Foreign Relations and the World Economic Forum, commanding the attention of business tycoons and political leaders around the globe, and his company is on the cusp of consolidating so much power that it could essentially control the world.
Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate.
The worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
The 2008 financial crash turned out to be an incredible opportunity for BlackRock. It secured an uncontested contract to control many of the banks that had collapsed. That gave Larry Fink, who was already incredibly wealthy, even more power, and a direct line to the American government. The same thing happened in 2020, during the early days of the pandemic, when the government called in BlackRock to protect the Federal Reserve from financial fallout. Periods of economic uncertainties like these were key to BlackRock's rise to power, and as the famous saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility, and BlackRock would like you to think that they are being responsible. In the summer of 2020, while the world was angry about the murder of George Floyd, BlackRock came out with a statement saying that companies had to serve a social purpose, and that they would be giving every company an ESG, or Environmental, Social, and Governance score. Companies that promised more diversity in hiring and leadership or offered environmentally friendly policies and technology received higher scores than companies that didn't. Although this concept had been around since 2004, BlackRock became the loudest proponent of ESG investing in 2020, and in all honesty, it worked. Before this statement, ESGs were mentioned in far fewer than 1% of earnings calls, but by May 2021 that number rose to around 20%, and it has since remained the fastest growing segment in the asset management industry. People are more concerned about the environmental and social impact of companies, and that's a good thing, right? Socially responsible companies get the upper hand in an ideal world, yes, but we all know that the world we live in is far from ideal. While there's been some positive improvement, the main result of BlackRock's ESG statement has been a massive surge in companies participating in practices like greenwashing, pretending they're more sustainable, diverse, or responsible than they actually are. It's also exposed the hypocrisy of BlackRock itself, because while it claims to champion ESG investing, the company remains the largest investor in fossil fuels and war profiteering, and maintains a pretty friendly relationship with human rights violators. And it's not just BlackRock, the second largest investment firm in the world, Vanguard, is guilty of the same technique, promoting ESG investing on the one hand, but on the other, unwilling to stop investing in oil and gas companies or pull out of companies with questionable human rights practices. We see this time and time again from BlackRock. They do something that seems like they're moving in the right direction in the eyes of the public, but behind the scenes, they're unwilling to tamper with their investments, even if it's for the greater good of society. Take climate change, for instance. BlackRock says that climate risk is investment risk, meaning that investing in companies that aren't creating policies to help address climate change is a risky move. In 2021, BlackRock actually did do something about this by helping shake up the board of ExxonMobil and installing new members who promised to take action on climate change. Previously, the oil and gas behemoth was responsible for 2% of the world's emissions. Now there are new self-imposed mandates to help reduce that over time. This is a great move by the company, no doubt, but the fact that it's still the world's single biggest investor in fossil fuels makes this feel more like virtue signaling than actually trying to make meaningful change, and the hypocrisy doesn't end there. As mass shootings continue to end lives in the US, BlackRock has spoken out against gun violence and said that gun manufacturers should do more to protect the lives of the American people. But who's the largest investor in gun manufacturers? You guessed it, BlackRock. The investment firm holds a 16% stake in Sturm Ruger, 15% in Vista Outdoor, and significant percentages of other manufacturers just like them. BlackRock says it talks to these companies about improving safety, but so far, It's unclear whether or not there's actually been any policy change. Outside of America, BlackRock's US Aerospace and Defense Fund has billions of dollars invested in major weapons contractors worldwide, like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. They're supporting these companies that then get huge Pentagon contracts and use taxpayer money to engage in violence and war around the globe. Often, these weapons are supplied to foreign governments in the name of peace, like Saudi Arabia, which received weapons from the US government and used them to indiscriminately attack civilians in Yemen during years of civil war. Funding this spurt of war and an increase in nuclear weapons shows that BlackRock constantly skirts its own commitment to human rights. So does its engagement with authoritarian governments. BlackRock is officially the first global asset manager to have access to China's mutual fund, leaving critics wondering, what did Fink promise Chinese President Xi Jinping to allow him to access the Chinese Communist Party's fund? To be fair, BlackRock isn't the only investment company out there looking to do business with China, but because of its widespread power, it's been the most successful in gaining a foothold in the controversial territory, which is surprising, especially for a US company. This power also made it a major player in the war in Ukraine. As we saw in China, despite its emphasis on ESG investing, BlackRock has a tendency to overlook human rights in favor of monetary gain. It's been investing in Russia's most prominent companies for years. The British pensions that BlackRock controls alone have contributed $630 billion to Russia. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, a precursor to what would become the more now than a year-long war in Ukraine, BlackRock reconsidered some of its investments in Russia, but just 1 year later, it was back to being among the top shareholders in the country's biggest corporations. Even when it became clear that Russian President Vladimir Putin was planning an invasion last year, BlackRock didn't budge, and like most other Western firms, it did, eventually, pull assets out of Russia once the war started. But think about all the money it flooded into Russia over the years. Money that the authoritarian government controlled and used in its expansion mission that led to this deadly war. All of this begs the question, how did one company gain this much global power and influence? Well, it started with technology. BlackRock's business is built on ETFs, or exchange-traded funds. An ETF contains diversified investments to reduce an investor's risk. Rather than buying stock in a single company, you're investing in a fund that buys stocks, commodities, and other securities. This practice proved to be very lucrative for BlackRock and its investors thanks to a portfolio management software it created in 1998 called Aladdin. Aladdin predicts the possible outcome of every investment and collects information and personal data on everyone who has ever knowingly or unknowingly given BlackRock money. This allows the software to predict how likely it is that a specific investment will fail. Eventually, this technology put Fink and BlackRock on top, making the company the go-to firm for ETF investing, which keeps getting more and more popular. Global ETF assets could explode to $25 trillion by 2025, meaning trillions more for BlackRock. But we don't need to wait until 2025 to see the effects of the power BlackRock has. Right now, BlackRock oversees assets worth 10% of the entire world economy. Companies like Fox, Comcast, and Disney have to consult with BlackRock before they make major moves, since it has such a large share of their ownership. BlackRock and other large firms like Vanguard are the biggest investors in global giants like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. This level of ownership creates an anti-competitive environment. You feel this in the prices of airline tickets. BlackRock and Vanguard are among the 5 largest shareholders of the 3 biggest airline operators, which means that there's very little incentive to lower prices in order to compete with each other. This level of ownership consolidation reduces consumer choice and raises prices, and it also means that eventually a handful of powerful people at these investment firms could wield more power than the executives at the companies they own shares in. Even Jack Bogle, who founded Vanguard, says that this kind of ownership concentration is bad. Too much money in the hands of too few will not work out well for the global economy. There are solutions that governments could put in place to stop these companies from gathering too much influence. Things like not allowing funds and ETFs to vote as shareholders in companies, or creating ownership caps that would dictate how much of a company can be owned by a single entity. The laws can be passed limiting how much influence an investment firm can have in the companies they're invested in, even if that influence is intended to be benevolent, like with the ESG. But how soon could any of this happen? Because BlackRock and Vanguard are less than a decade away from managing $20 trillion in assets. That would upend the asset management industry and intensify the already staggering ownership consolidation of the world's largest companies, sending prices through the roof. One of the biggest problems with this system of business is that the more money BlackRock manages, the lower its fees for investors, so we end up in this cycle where the best way to invest our money today creates a potentially catastrophic environment for our money and our society tomorrow. Unfortunately, most people don't have the luxury of looking that far ahead. What looks good in the short term is all that matters, and That is how BlackRock thrives. It hopes you'll overlook its hypocrisy around the environment, diversity, and human rights because it puts out statements about being a responsible company. Its future hinges on its investors not caring about these things. The problem is that many of its investors don't even know they're investors. They're simply part of a pension fund or an endowment that BlackRock manages. There are smaller funds that do support ESG investing without conflicts of interest, and there are options, like managing our own shares, that help us avoid the moral pitfalls of large companies like BlackRock. But much like how most of us couldn't live without Amazon's next-day delivery for our last-minute essentials, using these large flawed companies is just easier. Over the past decade, the public has become more and more critical of what massive companies do and say. As that magnifying glass emerged, BlackRock made sure that its messaging about making the world a better place was heard and publicized. BlackRock's hypocrisy won't end. Its public image versus private actions will most likely always conflict with one another, but as consumers and investors, it's our responsibility to know what's happening. Taking them at their word is the easier option, but that's exactly what BlackRock is betting you'll do. That's how they've gotten this far. This is the same ignorance that allowed banks and governments to drown us in debt. Click the video on your screen right now to find out more. Hey, if you like the videos we make and would want to support us to make bigger and better projects, we've recently just updated the Patreon. We have different tiers with perks like access to a private Discord server, a peek behind the curtains to hear from the team that makes these videos, discounts on all the merch we'll create in the future, and many more perks that will be decided by you guys, the patrons. If you don't have the means, then please don't feel obligated in any way. Subscribing and watching these videos is more than enough support, but if you do have the means and want to support in some way, then this is the best way to do so. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching. Do you own the music that you listen to? If you collect vinyl records or just happen to still have CDs laying around, then you do. But the majority of us in 2023 rely on subscription services like Spotify or Apple Music to borrow the music we enjoy. What about the movies you watch? Well, thanks to the access we have to streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon Prime, very few of us feel the need to own DVDs or VHS tapes anymore, and have instead become borrowers of the movies we watch as well. You think these are just subscription models, but what about the games you buy from Steam, the PlayStation Store, or Xbox Store? Do you own those games? Or do you just own access to those games? If you own it, shouldn't you be able to resell, lease, or even borrow it to someone else? These are just a few examples of how big tech has created a business model that almost entirely erased personal ownership. And entertainment is just the beginning. In 2016, a member of the Global Future Councils wrote this: "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better." This satirical article talks about something called the sharing economy and how society is moving towards the point where only a few people own everything and the rest of us simply borrow to live. In it, Ida Alkin proposes that as digitalization and subscription services continue to grow, people will own fewer personal possessions and instead become more accustomed to renting from and sharing with others, essentially trading in ownership for convenience. "In the future, people will rent my living room for meetings while I go to work," she writes. The invention of a rideshare service like Uber, Lyft, and Zipcar have made it easier than ever to not own a car. As a result, it's becoming increasingly more common for people to rely on the flexibility and convenience of these services rather than taking on the responsibility of becoming a vehicle owner themselves. For those who do go ahead to purchase their own vehicle, we've started to see car companies turn features that are supposed to come with a vehicle into subscription services. BMW recently received a lot of backlash when they quietly announced that they'll be blocking off features such as heated seats, heated steering wheels, automatic high beams, and adaptive cruise control, charging car owners a monthly fee to access features that should come with the car. Microtransactions like these are greedy and exploitative and keep the consumers tied to the companies even after a supposed transfer of ownership of a property. If I own the car, why do I still have to pay for some of its features? Features that should ideally come included with my purchase. Sadly, this is just the beginning of a slippery slope that will continue to chip away at the value of ownership. Some of you may be surprised to hear that we own less things now than we did decades ago. I know it sounds contradictory when news articles, TV shows, and YouTube videos tell us that we are at the pinnacle of a consumerism crisis. However, there has been some emerging research which suggests that actually, the peak of consumerism may have already passed. The Office of National Statistics ran a test in 2013, which showed that the average adult in the US owned 10.3 tons of personal possessions, a number which had dropped pretty significantly compared to the average 15.1 that was measured in 2001. But what exactly is so dangerous about living in a world that is slowly moving away from personal ownership and towards a sharing economy? Being an owner of a possession, whether it be something as large as a piece of property or as small as a DVD, provides us with a sense of personal and financial autonomy. Purchasing a home, for instance, is an investment, meaning that the money you pay towards the down payment and the mortgage of that home has the potential to come back to you in the future if you decide you want to sell the property. Even if you own a home that you have no intention of selling, the fact that it's yours still provides you with a personal sense of freedom, security, and sovereignty. Just knowing that if you run into any financial emergency, you can sell your house to solve that crisis gives you peace of mind. This example is most obvious when we talk about buying a home, but it extends all the way down to the ownership of every single material possession. The beauty of owning something, whether it's a property or a stainless steel pan, is that you can trade or sell it to recoup the money that it's worth. Looking back at the pieces of media we talked about in the beginning, when you bought a vinyl record, you could share it with a friend or sell it after you're done listening to it. Today, you can't even listen to your music without using a specific company's app or buying a game from the PlayStation Store and sell it to your friend once you're done playing. Right now, it might seem like trivial things, but imagine the world Ida Alkin paints in her article, where the average person doesn't even own their everyday household appliances because of how easy and accessible it is to rent and share them. If that futuristic world were to become our reality, wouldn't we all be a lot less in control of ourselves and the environment we live in? Wouldn't we all be simply floating through life, renting and borrowing things to get by? It's a scary thing to think about. Another concern that comes with the sharing economy, subscription services, and digitalization is the loss of personal privacy. Think about it. Streaming services such as Netflix and Spotify have all your data. To use these platforms, you kinda have to grant them the permission to learn everything about you, from your favorite kind of music to the movies you watch in the middle of the night when you're alone. Most of us are aware of these algorithms, but hardly ever consider them to be a compromise to our privacy because they're used in a way that helps make our experience on the platforms more enjoyable. But that's not all the data is being used for. Our information is constantly being sold to advertising companies to handcraft and deliver targeted ads to us, causing us to spend money we don't have on stuff we don't need. Furthermore, because you have provided these services with your name, phone number, email, home address, and credit card number, they have an enormous amount of access to your personal and financial information. With all that data being stored and tracked, it's no wonder that digital hacking is at an all-time high right now. The cost of being hacked rose nearly 15% in 2020, the highest year-over-year increase in IBM's dataset history. This increase was partly due to hackers and cyber gangs capitalizing on the chaos of the pandemic, but part of the reason why they were so successful was also due to how much personal data is readily available on the internet and how much of our personal information we give out to these big tech companies. At some point, we need to ask ourselves, should we really be paying for comfort and ease of use with our privacy? The biggest defense for subscription models is that they help us save on costs, where you would have had to pay around $10 for one album. For the same price every month, you can have almost every song in existence. And yes, we can't deny the fact that subscription models give us access to way more things at a reduced cost, but the reality, as with most things, isn't that straightforward. Because these subscriptions are automatic, over time, costs can sneakily add up without the consumer being fully aware of how much they're actually spending. Let's use Netflix as an example. When you first sign up for Netflix, you're mystified by the possibility of having unlimited access to approximately 50,000 shows and movies for only $15 a month, a fee that adds up to $179 a year. However, in reality, no matter how intriguing the idea of having so many options seems, no singular person will ever likely have the time or ability to watch all 50,000 of those movies and shows. Let's say instead, during that first year of being a Netflix subscriber, you end up watching 50 movies and shows. Although many would argue that paying $179 to enjoy 50 pieces of entertainment is still a great deal, as the cost of buying the physical copies of those 50 movies would have been far greater, there's still an underlying flaw in that equation. If you owned physical copies of those 50 movies or shows, for the one-time fees you paid to buy them, you would have unlimited access to them for the rest of your life. Whereas within the confines of the subscription model, the second you stop paying the recurring monthly fee, your access is cut off completely. So in reality, the cost isn't $179 a year, but $179 a year for the rest of your life, including every single price increase. Because again, you're locked into that one company if they're the only ones who have the movie or show you want to enjoy. There are also several situations where a person has the desire to watch just one specific show or movie, but the only way they can do so is to sign up for an entire streaming service, meaning that they'll pay roughly the same price to borrow that piece of entertainment as they could have to just own it outright and have unlimited access to it forever. And that is if they manage to sign up for and then cancel that subscription within the first month of their membership. It's been statistically proven that people chronically underestimate how much they're paying for streaming and subscription services. A survey commissioned by market research firm C+R Research illuminated that 54% of people underestimated the amount that they spend monthly on subscriptions by at least $100, and 24% underestimated it by over $200. On average, consumers spend $133 a month and about $1,600 a year, more than they estimated that they did on streaming services. All of this goes to show that subscription fees can become a slippery slope for people as they recur passively, which allows them to easily fly under a customer's radar and build up over time. This problem of ownership is not only caused by subscription services, the rise of digital assets as opposed to physical ones are also reducing what it means to own something. The best example of this is software. When you buy software, what you're buying is digital access to it. This is why you can buy something, but you still don't have the right to resell or even lend it to someone else. The danger with this is that we leave all the control in the hands of the companies. If you buy something and you decide it wasn't right for you, your only option is to hold out hope that the company you got it from has a return policy. If not, you'll be stuck with something that you can't get rid of and money you can't regain. Furthermore, streaming services and online websites that sell pieces of intellectual property, such as movies or video games, to consumers always have the option to discontinue their ownership of that property, thus making the consumer's ownership of it obsolete as well. Imagine paying Netflix's subscription for years just to watch your favorite comfort show, and then one day they just announce that they'll be removing it from the platform and you can do nothing about it. For most of us, this isn't something we have to imagine, it's something that has happened time and time again, and this is the final and most painful thing about the digitization of everything. If these things only exist in digital form, when licenses expire or these companies simply don't see the need to host the content on their platforms anymore, they'll be gone forever, lost forever. If big tech completely destroys ownership and all we have is borrowed, and all we own is digital, what would be in the museums of the future? You've just graduated college and worked your first month at your new job. You've worked extremely hard to get this position, and getting that first paycheck feels like such a triumphant moment. The possibilities of what you can do with your income are exciting. This is the first time you've had a sense of freedom over the money you've earned, but the sad truth is, you don't have any freedom, and that reality becomes clear when you open a letter you receive in the mail a few days later. It's from a student loan program informing you of your repayment schedule. This paycheck never really was yours. You owe money, you're in debt, and will be in debt for a very long time. And once the realization sets in, every coffee purchased or drink with a friend suddenly starts to feel like you're splurging with someone else's money. It makes you feel guilty and sometimes even depressed. This is the story of around 1 in 5 American adults who have student loan debt, but in reality, this isn't your fault. It's just one of the ways that governments and banks might be keeping you poor. The truth is, debt can lead you down a pretty dark road, especially if you're not concerned about falling deeper into it. Household debt in the US just hit a record high of $16.9 trillion. That's 16 with 15 zeros behind it. Even making 6 figures, you're more likely to be living paycheck to paycheck than thriving. Before continuing, I should clarify that not all debt is bad. It can give people opportunities that they might not have had otherwise. It allows startups to get off the ground without using personal capital, and it allows people to make big purchases that can be paid off in smaller chunks spread over a long period of time. But too much debt and lousy interest rates can cause severe problems. Studies suggest that being in debt can make you more anxious, depressed, and cause many people to experience suicidal thoughts. You might feel okay with how much you owe right now, but these mental health issues can grow bigger as your debt gets higher. Debt also makes your future feel limited. Your ability to travel, make big purchases, and move on to another phase of life is greatly challenged by the amount of money you owe. For instance, you can't get a mortgage if you have too much student debt. Debt can impact your relationships and health, and there are studies linking bad debt ratios to high blood pressure and higher rates of divorce. It goes back to that feeling of splurging on something using someone else's money. This feeling puts a spotlight on spending habits within a relationship, causing stress, arguments, and separation. You don't need to be a gambling addict to have fights over money. You might think it's okay to incur debt because when you die, it dies with you, but this isn't always the truth. A lot of different debts can be inherited by your loved ones, especially debts you've taken on with another person, like mortgage. Being in debt isn't great, but don't be too hard on yourself because it's not necessarily your fault. We live in a society that has institutionalized debt and has made borrowing a living commonplace. Think about it, we're encouraging young kids barely old enough to vote to take on thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars of loans just to get an education. We all know how terrible these loans can be, but one effect we don't really talk about is how they tend to normalize the idea of taking on debt to people who are just entering adulthood. This creates a mindset about money that takes a very long time to shake, even if it's possible to shake at all. A student who has a lot of loans to repay may also experience debt fatalism, a state where being in debt seems inescapable. If you're accustomed to existing in debt, it's difficult to picture what it's like to exist without it, and as a result, you're more likely to continue drowning in it. When people think of debt, there's often the stigma that it's the individual's fault. You hear finance gurus tell you about wasteful people who splurge on the latest iPhone and buy Starbucks every day instead of making coffee at home. And while there are certainly people who are responsible with credit, the reality is that most people who are in debt are there out of necessity. For one, people with children are far more likely to incur debt from the cost of taking care of a child. The same goes for people who have to take care of a parent. These two factors introduce a variety of necessary expenses that no amount of penny pitching will mitigate. Most people's financial literacy is also very poor. It's a subject that's seldom taught in schools, so we're often at the mercy of the lenders and the fine print that we don't bother to read. Even if we did take the time to read the terms and conditions while applying for a new credit card, would we even understand them? All of this without even talking about the system whose entire existence depends on debt: banks. Let's take a moment to look at how banks work. You give them money, 90% of that money is lent to someone else. The person taking the loan puts it in their account, and 90% of that amount is loaned to someone else, and so on. The bank charges interest on all those loans that were made possible thanks to your money. Debt is how they make money, it's the core of their business model. To make matters worse, banks are profit-driven and often use predatory practices to try and get you to incur more debt because their favorite clients aren't the ones who pay off their debt as quickly as possible, but the ones they refer to as revolvers. People who are perpetually in debt. Banks know your income and they know what you can't afford, but that doesn't seem to stop them from issuing you multiple credit cards or locking you into a high-interest loan. These are companies that pursue profits over the well-being of their clients. Imagine having several maxed-out credit cards and then piling on multiple high-interest loans until you can no longer afford the minimum payment on any of them. Where else can you go? Remember that dark road we talked about earlier? Well, that road can lead to someone taking their own life. This is what's known as debt suicide. People find themselves drowning in debt and feel like there's no other way to escape it. People in debt are 3 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts, and similarly, people who die from suicide are 8 times more likely to be in debt. Sure, you can say that ultimately the individual is responsible, but what about the corporations that nudge, push, and deceive these people into making poor financial decisions? What responsibility should they bear in all of this? Credit card companies, for example, will often use deceitful tactics like charging 0% interest for the first 6 months to try and get people accustomed to not paying off their credit cards. Then, when the high interest kicks in, there's a good chance the cardholder has already accumulated a ton of debt. Strategies like this are designed to nudge more and more people down the dark path, keeping them poor. It's how banks and credit card companies make more money. It's in the pursuit of bigger profits. They knowingly neglect the welfare of their clients. This can sometimes mean that the parents can afford to give their kids a decent start to life, or that the kids can afford to give their parents a decent end to life. These are the real consequences. We're destroying the lives of the common people to fill the pockets of the few at the top. These shady companies are on one side of the institutional debt equation. On the other side is what we need all that loan money for in the first place. The 2 biggest expenses in life of an average person in the US are an education and a home. And in the last 50 years, the cost of both have skyrocketed, far outpacing inflation. To what many would consider a good life with a home they own and a good education, most people either have to come from wealth or incur enormous debt. But why has college and university tuition risen so much? A main culprit in the US is the reduction of state funding for these schools. For the last 30 years, colleges have been a primary target for governments to cut costs, especially during recessions. This reduction has caused colleges to operate more like businesses to earn the money they need to stay afloat. But the unintended consequences of schools operating like businesses is that they are now more focused on competing aggressively with each other and trying to make the most profits, instead of focusing on the welfare of the students. This means that pursuing star professors and researchers with higher wages, keeping class sizes lower to be more attractive to potential applicants, and introducing a lot more extracurriculars to attract students, even though they might be an unnecessary expense that only increases tuitions further. There's no central mechanism in the United States to control the cost of higher education. The country does give students a fair amount of financial aid, but much of the country's college tuition is paid for through loan programs. In neighboring Canada, tuition has also risen a lot in the same period, even though it's more significantly subsidized for citizens. The problem remains that students across North America are paying a lot more for post-secondary education than they were before, and it's happening on the government's watch. But there's a much bigger cause of debt that has also exploded in cost in the last 30 years. Housing. The reason why housing is so expensive now is complicated. I'd love to write it off as greed, but that wouldn't be telling the full story. One of the main causes of housing's high cost is government regulation, but it's not quite what you think. Regulations are important. There's environmental impact analysis, soil sampling, and numerous other approvals that need to be acquired before a developer can break new ground. These are necessary but expensive steps that need to be taken today that wouldn't have been done 30 or more years ago, and it's great that we're doing them now. But there are other unnecessary regulations that aren't driven by human and environmental needs. These are housing density regulations, and they have a big impact on house prices. Housing exists in a system of supply and demand. More supply typically results in lower cost. A great way to increase the housing supply is to build higher density housing, like apartment buildings, but in many cities and towns across North America, regulations are preventing higher density housing from being built. And these regulations are often influenced by current homeowners who want their homes to remain at sky-high value. When high-density condominium buildings do get built in great numbers, there are still some other factors that can prevent home prices from falling. In Toronto, for example, developers build large luxury condos, ones that sell at a premium price. These condos wouldn't sell very well at those prices if not for a second factor that's keeping prices high: investment homes. These are homes that wealthy people buy up as investments, reducing the local supply and therefore increasing the value of these homes. Many luxury condos are purchased as investments only, leaving many of them sitting empty, even during a housing crisis. Governments have done little to intervene in investment housing and have instead prohibited solutions like higher density housing. Blame is often passed between levels of government, with local, state, provincial, and federal bodies blaming each other and kicking the can further down the road. And the result is that home ownership becomes an enormous source of debt for some people and not even a remote possibility for others. And there's no escape from this problem by simply renting either. The cost of rent has also skyrocketed as a consequence of higher housing prices, further leading into even more debt. Another problem for renters is when the companies buy existing buildings, give them a luxury renovation, and then jack up the price of rent. No new homes are built in this scenario, and the average price of a home and rent still goes up. The question of personal responsibility for debt doesn't seem so significant when you see how banks and governments are making increasingly larger debt loads inescapable. Debt is painful, and it seems like our largest institutions are too invested in profiting from it to make it easier on the average person. For now, we can make sure to not take on unnecessary debts and be sure to read the fine print when we do need to take out a loan. The truth is that governments can do a whole lot more to help their poorest citizens. The video on screen right now will show you how the richest man who ever lived did exactly that for his citizens. Picture all the gold you could possibly imagine. Now, double it. That's how much wealth the richest man who ever lived controlled. Yet most people will go their entire lives without ever learning his name. When asked who the richest man who ever lived is, given the rise of wealth inequality and the creation of money out of thin air in the form of cryptocurrency, it might be tempting to mention some modern billionaires, people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, or maybe the anonymous Satoshi Nakamoto. But all of these answers would be wrong. To find out who the richest person who ever lived was, you'd have to go back to West Africa in the 1300s during the Mali Empire. If you're not familiar with the greatness of the Mali Empire during that time period, don't feel bad, it's not your fault. Western history tends to ignore the achievements of African nations prior to colonialism. History books often focus on the progress made by great thinkers in the West, even when there's plenty of evidence to suggest that a lot of those discoveries had already been found somewhere else in the world. This is especially true in terms of mathematics and astronomy, but that's a subject better suited for its own video. The Mali Empire was an exceedingly wealthy one, with 3 large gold mines that accounted for half the world's gold reserves at the time. The region was thriving. Add to this the fact that they were also blessed with salt and copper, and you start to see just how wealthy this African nation was. In 1312 CE, Muhammad ibn Ku, the reigning emperor of Mali, set sail across the Atlantic to look for new land. Sadly, he was never heard from again. In his absence, Mansa Musa took over as emperor and would go on to make Mali one of the wealthiest empires in the history of humanity and make himself the wealthiest man who ever lived. When he took over as emperor, Musa quickly discovered that simply processing half the world's gold isn't enough to put you on the map. So he looked to expand the trading network of his empire in a bid to bring more business to the nation. At the time, Mali wasn't well known to Europe or the Middle East, where most of the large trading cities and city-states were. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim who knew how to speak and write Arabic. This allowed him to expand his trading network to the Middle East. You see, at least once in their lives, every Muslim is supposed to make a Hajj, or pilgrimage, to the sacred sites in Mecca, a city in today's Saudi Arabia. Mecca is the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, and this Hajj is believed to be the most intense of spiritual experiences for Muslims. In 1324 CE, Mansa Musa set forth on a 4,000-mile Hajj to Mecca, a journey that would literally put him and Mali on the Catalan Atlas, a medieval world map. On his Hajj, Mansa Musa traveled with his entire royal court. His officials, soldiers, griots, merchant camel drivers, and 12,000 enslaved people, all of whom were dressed in gold brocade and the finest Persian silks. Everyone on the pilgrimage carried large amounts of gold through the Saharan desert, with their camels taking the majority of the burden. Along the way, Mansa Musa and his entourage stopped at different cities, including Cairo in Egypt. They gave away gold to the poor, funded the construction of mosques, and contributed to a variety of public projects like public housing. By doing these things, he hoped to make the Hajj easier and less hectic for other Muslims, a show of empathy that was rare for leaders of his day. Mansa Musa gave away so much gold that he decreased its value, creating an economic crisis in the Middle East. In total, his generosity caused roughly $1.5 billion in economic losses. Once he realized what he had done, he tried to buy back as much gold as he could to fix the crisis, as he hadn't intended to cause financial distress to the cities he had visited. His generosity was spoken highly of wherever he went. He gave away so much to strangers that his griots, who were singing historical storytellers, did not like to praise him with their songs. They believed that he was wasting resources outside of the kingdom, but in reality, the emperor had so much wealth that he could give the entire world and still have more than enough to advance his empire. And so did he. Upon his return from Mecca, he annexed the region of Gao, the trading city of Timbuktu, and many other cities. In total, he annexed 24 cities. He then transformed Timbuktu into an enormous commercial hub. It had so much gold that it was considered a real-life El Dorado, the lost city of gold. Emperor Musa continued to grow his wealth by expanding his business outside of his empire. He helped establish this trans-Saharan trade route, which connected the Mali Empire to the Mediterranean and most of the world. He contracted great architects to build enormous mosques and universities that still stand today. He had the Sankore Madrasa Mosque converted into a university that hosted 25,000 students, 1/5 of the population of Timbuktu at the time. At its peak, Sankore University hosted the largest collection of books and scrolls in the world, roughly 1 million in total. Thanks to the university, the average citizen of Timbuktu learned how to read and write in Arabic, which was an astonishing literacy rate at the time. Mansa Musa invited scholars from all over the world to teach at the university on subjects like astronomy, mathematics, Quranic studies, and legal affairs. Over time, the university produced its own leading scholars who astounded even the most knowledgeable men of Islam. Many would go on to become professors at universities in Morocco and Egypt. It was a citadel of knowledge. Although the school hasn't been an active university for hundreds of years, the structures stand as a testament to the rich intellectualism of Western Africa before the age of colonialism. Mansa Musa's projects had a tremendous impact on the socio-economic well-being of the people of the Mali Empire. They helped shape and transform the values and quality of life of the Mali people in a way that astonished visitors. During his visit in 1354 CE, the great world traveler, Ibn Battuta, observed that the people of Mali were very timely in all their endeavors, including their daily prayers and business dealings. They also competed with each other to give generously to charity. Poetry and culture flourished, and the people followed strong rules of cleanliness. The women of Mali enjoyed freedoms not seen in most other places in the medieval world. So, Mansa Musa was able to provide a decent life for his subjects, but how much wealth did he really control? All historical accounts resist putting a figure on it. They want you to imagine the most amount of gold you can possibly think of, and double it. One of the only estimates of Mansa Musa's wealth is from the website Celebrity Net Worth, which wasn't even around in the 1300s. They estimate his wealth was around 400 billion in today's dollars. That would make him richer than any existing billionaire, but we can assume his net worth would have been far greater than that. It's also possible that Mansa Musa wasn't really the wealthiest man who ever lived. His successors technically had the same resources he did, and the gold mine and empire existed before he became the ruler of Mali. But what separates his wealth from the rest is how he used it. He gave away so much of it, and what he kept, he invested in his homeland and his people. Mansa Musa's notoriety came from spending and giving away his wealth, not hoarding it. Because at the end of the day, what good is a person's wealth if it doesn't touch people's lives? Many of us admire the billionaires of today, but for the most part, their wealth just sits idle or is used for vanity projects like buying a social media platform or the world's largest yacht. Yes, it's their money, and only they get to decide how they use it. The reality is, if we didn't have media sources constantly reporting on their personal wealth, it would largely be meaningless to us. Yes, some billionaires do have large philanthropic ambitions, like Bill Gates' efforts to eradicate smallpox and his fight against malaria. Then there's Jeff Bezos' plan to give away the majority of his wealth before he dies, but on the whole, most billionaires aren't exactly handing out gold bars to the poor, are they? Or in modern terms, sending Bitcoin to their crypto wallets. Though it's fun to imagine Elon Musk driving around in his Tesla, transferring Bitcoin or Dogecoin to people on the street. The reality is that Mansa Musa isn't some progressive hero by today's standards. He ran a slave owner state, albeit with a notable emphasis on standardizing the quality for the enslaved people. He was also an accomplished military leader. In his lifetime, he managed to annex 24 cities, growing his empire even more. And that's another quality that isn't exactly beloved by modern people. Details of how he annexed these cities are also not well recorded. All I'm trying to say is he wasn't a saint. He was still an emperor in the 14th century. But it is possible to admire the way he used his good fortune. He spent his wealth changing people's lives. He embraced the values of Islam in a way that lifted the average Mali person. Religious fundamentalist leaders today typically use their religion to control and harm the welfare of their people. Mansa Musa is a great example, if you're ever searching for one, of a religious leader who used his values earnestly to help his people instead of harming them. After he died, his sons took over the empire, letting it dissolve over time. It was strange, they had similar resources but seemed to lack something their father had. Musa had a good strategy and a desire to better his empire for his people. That, combined with his wealth, is what put him on the world map. Otherwise, I doubt we'd remember him as the wealthiest person who ever lived. He'd just be another forgotten king bound for the faded records of history. What would you do if you were the richest person on Earth? Watch this video next to find out, according to science, exactly how to spend your money if your ultimate goal is to be happy. This video is sponsored by Aura. If a family member calls you from jail panicking and says that they need you to wire them some money for legal fees, would you second guess them and potentially make the situation worse, or would you send the money immediately? In March 2023, a Canadian couple were faced with this exact situation. They received a frantic phone call from their son, Benjamin, claiming he was in jail and needed money. The voice on the phone was unmistakably his and insisted that they send him $21,000 immediately. And so they did, because they loved their son. But it wasn't their son on the phone. It was an audio clone of his voice, created by cyber criminals using AI-powered tools. You used to need a lot of audio to clone someone's voice, but now all you need is a TikTok. There are entirely legal and barely regulated programs like 11 Labs that use short vocal samples to create AI voices with the potential to scam people like Benjamin's parents. Whether it's audio, text, or even video deepfakes, AI-powered scams are becoming far more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. To understand how these AI scams work and what we can do about them, I spoke with cybersecurity expert Zulfikar Ramzan, chief scientist at Aura, the company that's trying to make the digital world as safe as it can for its customers.
What we're dealing with now is a national crisis. In 2022, I believe $10.3 billion was lost in cybercrime. Now, what's interesting is that the amount of money lost in physical theft was only $1.6 billion. So home burglaries accounted for $1.6 billion of cost. And so we're seeing a situation where online crime is now like 6-7 times bigger than physical crime. And I don't think most people even get that at a fundamental point and why we need to focus on this problem so critically.
In 2019, criminals used an AI-generated audio recording to trick the head of a UK energy firm into transferring £220,000 to a fraudulent account. This is considered one of the first criminals blatantly drawing on AI technology to execute a scam. Across the world, in China, someone used AI face-swapping technology to impersonate someone on a video call. The victim believed he was transferring 4.3 million won, or 662,000 US dollars, to a friend who needed to make a deposit during a bidding process. When the actual friend was later confused by the situation, the victim realized he'd been duped. Deepfakes have been around for a while, but generative AI like ChatGPT has taken their powers to the next level. Recently, a series of videos appeared on WhatsApp featuring fake AI-generated people with American accents supporting voice support for a military-backed coup in Burkina Faso. But what these people said had poor grammar, immediately outing the videos as fraudulent. If the scripts had been written by ChatGPT in fluent, somewhat eloquent English, it might not have been easy to tell that they were fake. There are already companies like Our One, based out of Tel Aviv, that allow users to pick an avatar, type a prompt into ChatGPT, and get a lifelike talking head, a completely AI-generated personality. The goal is to use these AI personalities to create personalized online ads, tutorials, and presentations, but they're also a signal of how this advanced technology can be used to trick people like you and me if someone uses it for harm. And it doesn't have to be audio or video. Phishing scams via text have been available for decades, and AI is making them even easier to deploy convincingly. If that isn't bad enough, scammers might not even need to convince you of anything to steal your information. Passcon is a password cracking program reported to crack any 7-digit password in less than 6 minutes. The software enters combinations of letters, numbers, and symbols, and pulls common words like sports teams and company names to get past what we might think of as an unguessable password. The common CAPTCHA prompts to prove we're not robots might be useless. GPT-4 tricked a TaskRabbit employee into solving a CAPTCHA test during its testing phase. It lied to the worker, stating that it was a visually impaired human to get them to complete the test. Although guardrails have been put into place to prevent GPT-4 from doing something like this in the real world, scammers are unfortunately finding ways around these guardrails. One of the many uses of ChatGPT is writing code. I use it almost every day, and this can be helpful to the average user who just needs a simple code for a website or as a tool to help coders be more efficient. But the problem with AI writing code is that often the difference between malware and regular software isn't the code itself, but the intent behind it.
Imagine I said, please generate the following code. Can you generate code that can hook the Windows keyboard API, that can collect keystrokes that were written, that are being typed in, take the output of those keystrokes and send them to a remote server using a protocol that is non-standard? And you might say, well, that seems like something really nefarious if somebody's collecting my keystrokes and sending it to a third party. That's what every keystroke logging piece of software does, and every keystroke logging malware follows those steps. But you know what else follows those same steps? Every instant messaging application that runs on your desktop.
AI can't figure out your intent, so there's no way to know when you're trying to create malware and when you want to create something legitimate. Following its release, Checkpoint Software Technologies reported that while ChatGPT can't create something too sophisticated yet, it could easily improve the efficiency of dangerous code that's been written. The good news is that AI creating malware isn't something we need to worry about. The bad news is that this doesn't mean we're safe from malware. It just means that hackers have had refined tools for creating malware for decades, which is why Aura provides you with an antivirus product to protect yourself and your family from malware. With these glaring digital safety concerns, why are companies not doing more to protect the average person from harm?
Historically, a lot of the tech firms that tried to solve this problem were really focused on the technical buyer, number one. And number two, many of the incumbents in the space were focused on a set of point problems that were then aggregated into a more comprehensive solution. So it started off with antivirus, then maybe personal firewalls, then eventually we got to things like online fraud, and so on and so forth. And many of these companies kind of got built by just creating a patchwork of individual solutions with no holistic way to tie them together to provide a suite of capabilities for the average user. And that's really where Aura is unique. Our real focus has been on creating essentially an all-in-one suite for consumers and their families that is designed for the consumer in mind from day one, that is designed with a common platform in mind, because security is not just a monolith, it's a mosaic.
These scams will continue to grow thanks to AI, so we must protect ourselves. You might think you're impervious to these scams, and might be right now, but the more advanced they get, the more difficult it'll be to spot, especially because many of these scammers already have tons of information thanks to data brokers.
Everything you do leaves a bit of a footprint. There's a set of maybe digital breadcrumbs, if you speak, or digital trails that you leave in every interaction. What data brokers try to go and do is collect data about you and coalesce that data into one place. Now you might think, hey, I left a bit of data here and a bit of data there. And in isolation, those two pieces of data may not be that valuable. When you put them together as well with other pieces of data about yourself, all of a sudden, you can build essentially a digital dossier that describes a person in a lot of detail, including things like their phone number, their email address, how to contact them, maybe the preferred way to contact them, etc. Now, it turns out that data brokers are required to give you the ability to opt out. So you can go to every one of these data brokers, say you don't want them to collect your data. They've got to essentially comply with your request. That's the good news. The challenge and the complication is that trying to do that at scale is very difficult because, number one, there are many, many data brokers out there. So trying to find every single one and opt out is not easy. Secondly, if you think about it for a moment, data brokers don't really want you to opt out because their whole goal is to make money off of you. And therefore, when you look at the instructions they provide you with to opt out of their services, they're often highly inscrutable, difficult to understand. They're sometimes written in 3-point font. There's a footnote somewhere that you've got to go dig up and find to be able to actually opt out of a data broker directly. So one thing that Aura does in particular is we have a service called Data Broker Opt-out where we actually have automated that process. So you have to just give us your email address and any other salient information about you. We will scan every data broker to find your information, and we'll automatically opt you out of that data broker because we know how they work, how to opt out, and we can automate that mechanism for you.
Governments around the globe are looking to regulate AI and educate citizens. China is the only nation that has enacted hardline rules to grapple with AI. Europol, the European policing body, has also started engaging stakeholders and holding workshops on how criminals might employ programs like ChatGPT for nefarious purposes. Still, we can't wait for our government or employer to save us. Protecting ourselves from these AI-driven cyber crimes is our own responsibility, which can be scary.
Our founder, Hari, was a victim of identity theft many years ago, and when he tried to navigate the sea of solutions to deal with identity theft, he realized that this is a mess. And he, was somebody who'd done very well, successful entrepreneur. He had the resources to go do the research himself and have people do research on his behalf. And they came back with a 35-page plan that he had to go implement. And he's like, what is the average person going to do? How can they solve this problem? And what's remarkable is that before you couldn't scale solutions to work for the average consumer, but now we can leverage the power of AI for good. We can leverage the power of AI to automate, to create almost like a personal digital Sherpa that can guide you on this complex digital terrain and help you navigate the risks and the storms and the different types of treacherous grounds you'll face along the way. And I think there's an incredible promise here of AI being used for good and to solve a problem that I think is at the heart, and will be at the heart of every consumer right now. If they don't realize it, they should realize it at some point, because you can't navigate the digital world safely without solutions like Aura's being in place.
If I asked you the question, what is man's greatest invention? What would your answer be? There's a lot of options. Would it be fire? Because it gives us warmth, protection, and the ability to cook our meals. Or perhaps you would pick the wheel, because it's the driving force behind the beginnings of trade, commerce, and travel. While both of these are excellent choices, most of the time when we think about the greatest inventions of mankind, we tend to forget one of the most important ones of all: money. But unlike man's other great inventions, money is immaterial. Maybe that's why we don't often think of it in the same breath as some of the other great inventions. Things like fire and the wheel are tangible, but not money. Money is merely an idea, an illusion whose value is non-existent, only determined by the importance we place on it. Or at least money as we know it today. However, the fact that money is an illusion does not in any way undermine its importance. Before we created money, we were forced to trade goods and services directly in what we refer to as the barter system, people exchanging goods and services for other goods and services in return. Because there was no arbitrary value placed on these items, every single trade was determined by what each party was willing to give up for something that they wanted. It was kind of like a game. If I wanted some of your vegetables for dinner, but I only reared cattle, I would have to give you one of my animals in exchange for a bag of vegetables. If I wanted shoes to wear, but I only made tents, I would have had to give you an entire tent in exchange for a pair of shoes. And immediately you can already see one of the major problems with this system of trade. It's the asymmetry. As a tent maker, there's no way I wouldn't feel cheated having to exchange an entire living space for simple footwear. Because there was no standardized medium of exchange, it was very difficult to get two people who needed things from each other to come to an agreement. Having to wait until a double coincidence of once where two people need the exact opposite thing at the same time was also very difficult and inefficient. And that wasn't all. You see, our money is not only a medium of exchange, it's also considered a store of value. And before the invention of money, some people could never store their wealth for no fault of their own. Think about the farmer who sells tomatoes and the man who makes tents. The man who makes tents can create an entire village of real estate and barter it out with anyone who needs a place to rest their head all year long, and he would probably cash out on that. But the farmer who sells tomatoes can only barter when tomatoes are in season. And because tomatoes are perishable goods, he cannot keep them for a long period of time. So, although he would be putting in the same effort into his business as the tent maker, there's absolutely no way for him to remain wealthy all year long. There's also the problem of having something that only very few people want. Nowadays, when starting a business, you're often told to find a niche, a small group of people who are very interested in what you have to offer. Before money was a thing, that advice would have you left with nothing worth bartering. The people who had the most were those who owned things that everyone wanted. Things like weapons, animal skin, and salt. But then since everyone knew that everyone wanted these things, they started buying them even if they didn't need them at the time, just so they could trade with them later. And so commodity money became a thing. People would exchange goods and services for the most common items, like salt or weapons, and just use that to trade for what they want from someone else. From salt and weapons to tiny collectibles like shells and beads, humanity had found a better way to trade and transact. Instead of exchanging goods and services for goods and services you may not need at the time, you can exchange your goods and services for arbitrary objects to act as placeholders of value, an IOU, or IOU. After that, you can use these placeholders to get goods and services you actually want from someone else. The idea was brilliant, so brilliant that the entire world slowly moved away from the barter system to the money trading system. But there was still one problem with this medium of exchange. You see, for money to be worth anything, it needs to be scarce. The more available something is, the lesser its implied value. That's basic economics. If everyone can get their hands on something, it can't be worth that much, right? So things like sand or shells that you could easily pick up on any beach weren't really a good measure of value. As a result, around the year 770 BC, the first metal coins were created in China. As a sort of homage, the Chinese made miniature versions of the tools that were once regarded as currency. They made the coins circular so that it was easy to reach into your pocket and take them out without hurting your fingers. Then they cast the coins in bronze. This was it. Money was finally worth something. You couldn't just go to a beach somewhere and pick up bronze. It was scarce. It had value. At this time, money wasn't yet an illusion. The value of a coin was determined by the value of the metal the coin was made out of. If you had a coin that was made from 1 gram of gold, it was worth 1 gram of gold. You could easily measure it and see for yourself that it is, in fact, 1 gram of gold. However, kings and rulers quickly discovered the power of money. They realized that the more of these tiny precious metals you had, the more power you could control. And so in 600 BC, Alyattes, king of Lydia, created the first official money mint. He created the coins using a mix of silver and gold, and stamped an image on the coin to act as denominations. Now people could easily tell the value of the piece of metal they were holding simply by looking at the picture on its face. But the kings of the world wanted more money, and precious metals were too expensive. To produce more money, they started slimming down the coins, then mixing the more expensive metals with cheaper metals. Soon, all the coins in circulation were worth less than what the image on their face said they were worth. and so the illusion of money was born. The value of the coin was no longer determined by the value of the metal. The value of the coin was now simply what the rulers in the bank said it was. So 1 British pound sterling represented 1 pound of sterling silver. However, when international trade became a thing, people realized that metal coins were too heavy to lug around, and so kings around the world started issuing IOU certificates for long-distance trading. Because these pieces of paper were stamped by the king, people trusted its value and believed that they could use it to get back whatever it was worth in coins, and that was true for the time being. As more of these IOU certificates flooded the market, people needed coins less and less, until finally, the paper was worth what we believed it was worth, even if we no longer exchanged it for physical pieces of gold and silver. From ancient kings to modern-day governments and central banks, money has remained an illusion, a mere representation whose value is determined by the importance people place on it. The most valuable banknote in circulation today is the 10,000 Singapore dollars note. Although not being produced anymore, this single piece of paper worth $7,345 at the moment is still regarded as a legal tender, so you can still use it to buy things, valuable things like houses, cars, and even metals like gold. The banknote itself costs less than 20 cents to produce, but the illusion of the fiat currency system means it's as valuable as 120 grams of gold. Fiat is the fancy word we use to describe the modern-day illusion. It's a Latin word that translates to "let it be done." It's a decree by the government that, in the case of money, determines what its value is and enforces it as legal tender. The illusion of money is one that we never really think about, but just like the kings of old, the governments of today understand the power of money and, as always, want more of it. They know that the more of these pieces of paper you have, the more power you have. So what do? Well, they can simply create more pieces of paper out of thin air. Yes, if, for example, the United States government wanted $340 million for, I don't know, maybe another F-22 jet, they can simply print the money to do so. But there's one problem with this: inflation. The thing about money is that primarily, it needs to be a means of exchange to be considered valuable. So the amount of money in circulation needs to reflect the output of the goods and services that are being produced. When more money is printed than there are goods and services, all other things being equal, the prices of these goods and services increase and the value of the money itself drops. This is why many economists, and even everyday people like you and me, are worried about the current global reserve currency, the United States dollar. 2020 was a terrible year for the entire world. In the wake of the pandemic, most economies had to be shut down. The goods and services available and the general output of the economy was reduced to mere trickles, and the world kind of came to a halt for a while. Because there wasn't as much money flowing around, to keep the economy from going under and basically our world falling apart, the US government started printing money at a rate faster than has ever been printed before in its entire existence. Right now, 40% of the US dollars in existence today were printed in the last 18 months alone. That's outrageous. And because the output of the country hasn't really increased by that much, eventually, the prices of the goods and services might start to skyrocket. You can see this taking place in the price of commodities, such as lumber, which had as much as tripled in price from just a year ago. If you haven't noticed, some of the prices of the things at your favorite restaurants are now slightly higher than they were last year. It's an ever so small increase. Maybe the guac at Chipotle is 20 cents higher, but it's happening right there under your nose. On the surface, it seems like a good thing that governments decided to send out stimulus and unemployment checks to their citizens. But the reality is, it's a double-edged sword. Of course, it helps those most in need, and that's a good thing. We're at the point where, because of inflation and a slowed economy, people really aren't able to get the right jobs at the right times. Sometimes it's not even because they don't want them, but because it's simply worse than the alternative. For example, in the United States at least, if you're a waiter or a waitress, you aren't required by law to be paid even minimum wage. Some are literally paid $2 to $3 an hour, with the rest of their income coming from tips. But with a lot of restrictions and rules in place around the country, and not as many people going out, there's less customers. Less customers with less money means less tips. If your employees aren't making enough money, they're going to quit. Simple as that. If your business doesn't have employees to help you run it, you're going to go under. It's a domino effect. But what can you even do? When you can earn more money from unemployment and stimulus checks than you would from being employed, why even look for a job in the first place? You see, the Federal Reserve of the United States is a very sneaky way for the government to essentially create money out of thin air and pump it into the economy without people thinking too much about it. Before 2020, the United States was $29 trillion in debt. It's an unbelievable and inconceivable amount of money to even begin with. This debt is obtained in the form of bonds and treasury notes, which are basically just pieces of paper that say the government will pay you so-and-so amount plus interest. Right now, a 10-year US Treasury bond will return you about 1.23% on your investment at expiry. So if you put in $1,000 today, you'll have made $12.30 by 2031. That sounds terrible already, but to add icing onto the cake, it doesn't even keep up with inflation, which is targeted to stay around 2% a year. It's a lot higher than that, but that's for another time. By investing in government notes of your own country, which issues the currency you use every single day, you actually lose buying power over a decade. It is weakened by the day. But regardless, banks, businesses, and individuals around the world buy these bonds and treasury notes, and the government uses all that money it gets back how it sees fit. However, when it's time for the government to pay its debt, all the money they made has already been spent. So they buy back all the treasuries and bonds, but only from the big financial institutions, and then pay them back with new money created out of thin air. Since March 2020, the Federal Reserve has bought back over $1 trillion in bonds, and is planning to continue to do so for the foreseeable future. With all the new money pumped into them by the government, banks can now give out more loans to people, earn more interest, and help grow the economy. But this increases the total amount of money in circulation, reducing the value of each dollar. With multi-trillion-dollar stimulus payments and infrastructure packages, it makes you wonder how long this stuff can go on for. New money steals value from old money. The amount in your bank account doesn't change, but because of the new money the government has just printed out of thin air, your money is no longer valuable as it once was. Basically, every second you store your wealth in any fiat currency, such as the US dollar, it is being devalued. You could stare at your bank balance, and day by day, you'll be able to buy less and less things with whatever you have left. The reality that money is nothing but an illusion is one that we must all embrace, because only then will the path to financial freedom become clearer. It's all a game that never truly ends. Understanding that money does not have any intrinsic value in itself, but instead only inherits the value we give to it, will prevent you from trying to store up your wealth in currency. Instead, using that money to acquire assets that will appreciate faster than inflation is the only way to win the game. And it's not really winning, it's avoiding total loss. As more and more money is printed each and every day, the value of each dollar in your pocket will continue to decrease. But the dollar value of the assets around the globe will continue to appreciate in value. But it's all a mirage, it's smoke and mirrors. A stock market that is literally in up-only mode may make it seem like it's all okay. But it isn't. It's all denominated in the same currency that is slowly dying each and every day. For example, if you were to denominate the Dow Jones, which is just a performance measurement of 30 large United States companies, in terms of gold instead of USD, you'll see that we're basically at the same place we were in 1997. Smoke and mirrors. But what's the end goal of all of this? With fiat and an unlimited supply of money, will the value of each currency just continue to decrease until the end of time? Will the gap between the rich and poor just continue to grow wider and wider? Or are we finally going to fix a problem as old as man itself, and stop placing our financial success in the hands of those who are destroying it day by day? Only time will tell. But just know, there is a way out. The Wizard of Oz, Frankenstein, Citizen Kane, some of the greatest movies ever made were made during the famed studio system era of Hollywood. We, as audiences, look back on this era with nostalgia. What an exciting time it must have been to be alive. From the 1920s through the late 40s, 8 companies controlled almost every single film made in the United States. Each of these companies contracted writers, directors, actors, and crew to be full-time employees. Sometimes a studio would loan an actor or a director to another studio, but ultimately the heads of these studios were in total control of the artist who worked for them. The lack of competition and the concentration of power eventually caught the attention of the federal government, and the studios were broken up. No longer could they own their talent, nor could they both be the company that made the movie and the company that owned the movie theater it would be shown in. The studio system came to an end by 1950, and the entertainment industry was forever transformed. But the days of a handful of companies controlling what we consume were far from over. 75 years later, 90% of all the media in the United States is controlled by just 6 monstrous conglomerates: the Walt Disney Company, Comcast, 21st Century Fox, Time Warner, Sony Corporation, and Viacom. These companies own everything from CNN to ESPN to Hulu to National Geographic to DC Comics and Nickelodeon. In 2021, they earned $478 billion in revenue, more than the combined GDP of Finland and Ukraine combined. Nowadays, not trusting the media has become mainstream, but even if you attempt to avoid cable news or sitting on your couch for hours on end watching television, there's no way to truly escape the influence that media has on all of our lives. Media molds us. It tells us which world events deserve our attention or which movies and TV are worth seeing. It can affect what we buy, and it can shape our opinions on every significant topic, from immigration to healthcare. And of course, it has more than a significant sway when it comes to elections. Modern media companies want to make us feel like we have options across the political and cultural spectrum, but it's simply an illusion of choice fabricated by the people in control, the small group that runs these companies and infiltrates your life day in and day out. They present us with what seems like endless options when in fact every network, channel, company, or platform is answering to the larger entity that owns it. And we certainly didn't get here by accident. Back in the 1940s, the Federal Communication Commission, which regulates the media, had rules limiting ownership of multiple media outlets like radio and TV stations. And in 1983, media in the United States was owned by 50 different companies. That all changed in the 80s and 90s. The 80s roared into picture, and soon a newly elected President Reagan embraced deregulation and an exceedingly free market economy. By the 1990s, only 9 companies remained in charge. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, signed by President Clinton, was the cherry on top of Reagan's deregulation. The act declared that large companies and media could further expand their control. At the time, only 3% of Congress voted against this bill. Suddenly, small TV and radio stations were either bought up by big companies or failed because they couldn't compete. It was reported at the time that a consumer group tried to buy ad space on CNN to criticize the telecommunications bill, but CNN, which was owned by one of these mega corporations, wouldn't sell the group the airtime. By 2020, the number had shrunk from 9 to 6 ultra-powerful companies. As the years have gone on, power has gotten more condensed, and any regulation that is passed or lifted is done so without much publicity. This makes it very hard for citizens to get the facts straight and for voters to push back on any policy decision. But what does this kind of concentrated ownership really mean? Well, it means that fewer individuals and organizations control shares of the mass media. When controlling entities like the government decide that a free market is more beneficial than imposed regulations on businesses, companies act quickly because, after all, it's in their interest to consolidate. Merging and consolidating power can increase profit margins, reduce risk, and get rid of the dreaded competitive edge that we're all fighting for, so it's no wonder that these mega companies spend millions of dollars every year lobbying to sway legislation in their favor. But a concerning control over our political system is far from the only problem with ownership concentration. As anyone who has taken an introductory economics class can tell you, deregulation can lead to consolidation of power, like we saw back in the studio system and like we're seeing now in media as a whole. The monopolies born out of that consolidation would be great for providers but bad for customers. Not only is this model riddled with conflicts of interest, as billionaires like Jeff Bezos own the very publications, like the Washington Post, that are supposed to be reporting on them. But when 6 companies control all the information that we consume, it threatens diversity of expression and reduces diversity of viewpoints and content and news coverage. This narrowing of perspective then forces us as audiences to silo ourselves. Are you an MSNBC person or a Fox person? Our identity becomes wrapped up in what media we consume and therefore what ideas and facts we prescribe. Ownership concentration also limits competition and therefore decreases consumer choice. How many times have you craved a truly unbiased news source or been looking for an old movie on your streaming services and you can't seem to find the thing you're looking for? If the channels or services you subscribe to don't have what you're looking for, you're out of luck. Ultimately, we all end up spewing the same talking points and discussing the same TV shows. We get nice and cozy in our echo chambers because the media we've been consuming has a vast influence on public opinion and discourse. It shapes the narrative in our society and often pushes us in a specific direction that we might not have gone in otherwise. This, understandably, worries some about the impact ownership concentration might have on our democracy and the free flow of information. We're less likely to consider other points of view that don't come from news sources we like. We don't take a chance on smaller movies or shows that don't get big marketing pushes because we're consumed with the blockbusters that are pushed to us. That illusion of choice starts to change how we think, socialize, and live our lives. But it's not just our psyche at play here. When 6 companies control everything, they can change the way the country and the world operate. Depending on what economic narrative they decide to push, they can influence consumer spending and habits, which can have immediate impacts on the economic climate. What controls the stock market? Essentially, the 250 or so executives who have the power to decide what information almost every American has access to. And we've seen this before during the studio system era. It was on a smaller scale as the size of Hollywood in the 30s and 40s paled in comparison to the size of the overall media market now. But could that be a cautionary tale? In 1938, the federal government charged 8 studios that controlled Hollywood with being monopolies under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, and they were forced to break up. They divested from movie theaters that they owned, and artists were free to work for whoever they wanted, allowing them an opportunity to shape their careers. And audiences benefited from the burgeoning independent film business. But what goes around comes around, because by the 1980s, deregulation was the name of the game again. Under the Reagan administration, the antitrust department was cut by 50%, and businesses took advantage of the ability to buy up their competitors again. In 1994, we saw the first significant integration of film and television when Viacom acquired Paramount for $7.6 billion to become the second largest media conglomerate at the time. And a few years later, they bought CBS. This unleashed a pattern of mergers like Disney buying up ABC in 1995 and Time Warner buying TBS in 1996. By 2010, around 90% of filmed entertainment's domestic revenue came from 5 companies: NBC Universal, Viacom CBS, Warner Media, Walt Disney Studios, and Sony Pictures. But these weren't even the companies that owned the entertainment they created. Each of these powerful companies is still owned by even larger companies like Comcast and Time Warner. But this new consolidation in entertainment had much further reaching effects than its ancestor, the studio system. Now, all of these companies don't just own movies, but TV stations and news organizations that dictate precisely how we should think and feel about politics and culture. We are in a time when media integrity is being tested. Do media outlets have the ability to serve the public interest as they're meant to and aid the democratic process? I think most of us would argue the answer is no. We've entered an age where we see a plurality of political, cultural, and societal points of view. This plurality can be internal or external. Internal plurality looks like everyone who works for a company adhering to the same viewpoints. This can mean that journalists or news anchors are all told to talk about the same things, investigate the same stories, and push the same cultural narratives. External plurality tells us about the overall media landscape, because even if you have all the journalists working for a particular outlet operating the same, if there's enough of those outlets to represent different viewpoints and different stories, consumers are still getting a variety of choices. But what we're approaching now is an external plurality where most of our news and cultural outlets are either owned by the same company or have a similar agenda. The objectivity we expect in journalism is an illusion. We're fed the appearance of balanced news, but we all know it's anything but. And it's not really the journalists' fault themselves. Many who work for outlets owned by the Big Six answer to the owners of their companies and ultimately serve whatever narrative those owners want to push. Often journalists are risking their jobs if they pursue stories that might reflect poorly on the company they work for or the person who runs it. This obviously interferes with journalistic independence, and inevitably, crucial stories get burned. However, in the free market world that we've embraced, which allows big companies to consolidate and knock out the competition, owners can decide the strategy of their company. But it's not always smooth sailing. There's politicians, organizations, individuals who try to push back on it. So these huge conglomerates spend millions of dollars every year lobbying for their interests. One report showed that the association, which represents more than 90% of the cable market, spent more than $14 million trying to influence policy in 2021. Comcast alone spent $13.38 million that same year. They're both in the top 15 spenders for political lobbying that year. And beyond lobbying, the profits these mega companies rake in translate to more political influence. The owners of the media giants contribute directly to campaigns so they can be in the pocket of whoever might end up in power. And the outlets they control decide what the discourse around political elections and issues look like. When it comes to the news, local stations and newspapers are dying out. Now, more than 2,000 US counties lack a daily newspaper, and it's led to all of us embracing solely national issues and divisions, while the things and people we face in our own backyards go unnoticed and unresolved. While the Big Six exercise the most control over our media, other companies like Sinclair Broadcasting are also responsible for ownership concentration in specific areas. Sinclair owns almost 200 TV stations in 86 markets across the US. You might have seen a viral video that showed dozens of news anchors from different local stations reading the same script, and they all work for Sinclair-owned stations. The former FCC commissioner calls Sinclair the most dangerous company out there that people have never heard of for both its scope of ownership and its far right-leaning ideological agenda. And there are other giants out there as well, like Gannett, which owns over 100 daily US newspapers, and iHeartMedia, which owns over 800 radio stations nationwide. And that's to say nothing of social media companies like Meta that buy up smaller ones like Instagram and WhatsApp to control the way we consume information online, but that's a whole nother video. We are of course lucky to live in a democracy in a free market economy that allows for competition and innovation. We don't have state-owned TV like Russia, and as much as these 6 companies control the narrative, we as individuals have the freedom to speak our minds and oppose that narrative. But even if the government doesn't control every moment of our lives and every piece of content we consume, we can't overlook the people that do, and we can't overlook why they do it. Perhaps the former Walt Disney CEO Michael Eisner put it best in a leaked memo. We have no obligation to make history, we have no obligation to make art, we have no obligation to make a statement. To make money is our only objective. If you're watching this right now, chances are you spent many years of your life feeling misunderstood. Maybe you coped by spending hours online or listening to pop punk alone in your bedroom. You might have wished to run away, or for a simple answer that would sort out all the mixed up feelings in your head. A young person's life isn't always easy. Many teens suffer from severe anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. Compounded by school stress, relationship drama, and family pressures, mental illness during youth is intense. Thousands of young people die by suicide every year. But many more teens don't suffer from mental illness. Sure, managing school, interpersonal relationships, and growing responsibilities is challenging, but learning to deal with these struggles and becoming resilient is a part of life. So why is it that when you scroll on TikTok or Twitter, teens seem so, well, just sad? It's not just the teens. People of all ages repost memes making fun of depression or TikToks of what they ate while suffering from an eating disorder. There are highly aestheticized accounts of suffering, whether earnest or ironic. Some of them make us laugh while others inspire us to sort of want these things. What's going on here? No one ever sees physical illness and thinks, I want that for myself, so why is it different with mental illness? The reality is that your perception of mental health warps how you view your own, and if it's culturally acceptable to joke about or aestheticize mental illness, it might become an alluring, sexy, or desirable condition to have. Do you ever fantasize about being mentally ill despite having no formal diagnosis? It might seem dark to admit it to yourself, but the truth is that you could be romanticizing mental illness without even knowing it. Let me be clear that the reality is mental illness ruins lives. It's messy and complicated, it strains families, makes it challenging to work, and is way more complex than a meme or TikTok can portray. So why is it alluring to flirt with the aesthetics of mental illness? I was particularly drawn to Tumblr posts in my youth because they depicted an idealized version of some dire circumstance. They let me see the pain in the world through rose-colored lenses. And it's not just social media, it's in film and television as well. Stories that depict mentally ill characters help us reimagine and work through our mental health struggles. Films like Girl, Interrupted, Silver Linings Playbook, and Fight Club show stories of what it's like living with mental illness and how it affects relationships with family and friends. To someone going through similar struggles, it might be relatable to see parts of your story represented on screen. For others, stories about mental health might offer you a new perspective, start a productive conversation, or open a channel for empathy. The problem though is that aesthetics will always be at the forefront of how we connect to art. Angelina Jolie and Jennifer Lawrence are stunning Hollywood actresses. Tyler Durden of Fight Club represents a male ideal that some might strive for. This is how the media makes us romanticize mental illness by making it more attractive and desirable than it really is. And when you glorify mental illness, you convince yourself to believe a situation is better than it is in reality. Think about the lives of some of the world's most famous artists. Marilyn Monroe was a beautiful movie star and one of the greatest actresses of all time. Her struggles with eating disorders, pill addiction, and depression are a part of her tragically glamorous story. Culturally, her mental illnesses are linked to her iconic status. In public memory, her beauty and her pain are intertwined. As a result, all the parts of her life are romanticized, even the less romantic elements. And what about Kurt Cobain, the lead singer of the 90s grunge band Nirvana? His music gave voice to a generation as he made art about what it was like living with depression and addiction. His death by suicide in 1994 solidified his icon status in the music world. His death is part of his legacy as an artist, and how he died provides a lens through which we can look at the art he made while he was alive. We see his genius as inseparable from his mental illness. Vincent van Gogh follows a similar pattern. He spent most of his life painting in obscurity, out of the public eye. Only after his death did the public learn about his mental illness and start associating that with his creativity. Whether it's drunken nights in Paris or the infamous cutting of his ear, the public's understanding of masterpieces such as Starry Night and Sunflowers is tied to Van Gogh's mental health struggles. It endears people to his story and transforms him into a tragic genius of sorts. The intersection of mental illness and art is a prime example of romanticization. We look up and admire artists who create work we love. We assume their mental illnesses offer them clairvoyance and the unique ability to create magnificent art. That's why so many young artists believe they must suffer to be like the greats, who subconsciously wish mental illnesses upon themselves in hopes that it would help them create better art. Today, it's no longer just artists creating masterpieces that paint a pretty picture of mental illness. It's everyone who has a camera and an internet connection. There's this phenomenon called thinspo, where people suffering from eating disorders post pictures of their starved bodies online along with diets to inspire others to achieve a similar look. In the same vein, people post aestheticized pictures of self-mutilation in an attempt to encourage others to do the same. All you have to do is scroll through any social media platform to find countless seemingly harmless memes about wanting to die, to recognize that deteriorating mental health is a popular topic of conversation among people. Before the internet, these feelings had no outlet to be aired publicly. They only happened alone or among small groups of friends, if at all. Now, not only do they have an outlet, but they have the distribution to reach millions of people in an instant. And it begs the question, is the online discourse surrounding mental health productive, or is it distorting the reality of those who struggle daily? The truth is that romanticization of mental illness is not black or white. It can be destructive, yes, but it also has its benefits. It seems contradictory to reframe suffering and mental anguish as desirable. It sounds more logical to want a happy life, free of anything that could get in the way of the ultimate contentment. Why would you like to invite suffering? Isn't that something you would want to cast away? It makes total sense on paper, but the reality is that suffering is a part of life, whether we want it or not, and spinning it as something noble, exciting, or cool can genuinely help people get through these issues. This is what romanticization helps with. You convince yourself that you're mysterious, edgy, or aloof instead of socially anxious or depressed. Instead of feeling like an outcast, you become a rebel, championing the fight against the status quo, and you take your pain and turn it into an identity that gives you social credibility. Romanticization allows your situation to feel acceptable, loved, or even coveted by mainstream society. You regain a sense of total control and power when you feel powerless. When you romanticize, the narrative of your life is in your own hands, and you can reframe your suffering however you please. In a moderate and controlled environment, I don't see a massive problem with some light romanticization of mental illness. Even when life feels the worst, there can still be funny, enjoyable, and beautiful moments. And finding joy in those moments amid your struggle, or trying to see your situation through a different perspective, can help you get through it. There's been a positive push towards destigmatizing mental illness in recent years. As a culture, we're trying to eradicate the shame historically associated with mental illness, and people are more willing to honestly discuss their struggles and receive treatment when necessary. While this is a positive step forward, the conversation about mental health has become too ordinary in some ways. It's essential to have open and honest conversations about mental illness, but if, by definition, Romanticism misrepresents mental illness. How is honesty possible? Can true healing happen in a society with some romantic outlook on mental illness? The worst thing about romanticization is when it's done by people who are not mentally ill, but wish to be. Those who take on the aesthetic of mental illness without understanding the real pain it actually causes people. Some people make a particular condition the cornerstone of their content and turn symptoms into fun little quirks that their young fans might start to mimic without knowing how damaging it can be in the long run. Content posted by teenagers in their bedrooms now serves a similar function to the representation on TV and in movies. Only now viewers can access it on their phone while in bed, waiting for the bus or during downtime in class. And the problem is that consuming too much mental health-oriented content can lead to self-diagnosing or identifying with a mental illness that you don't clinically have. It's a form of mimetic desire, which are desires we mimic from the people or culture around us. People might feel an average amount of sadness and think they're depressed. Mood swings are explained by bipolar disorder. Neatness and particularness turn into OCD, and difficulty focusing on a specific task becomes an ADHD diagnosis. The genuinely undesirable symptoms are often left out of these fantasies. With severe depression comes suicidal ideation. Bipolar disorder makes it challenging to have a steady job or healthy relationships. Some people with OCD find it hard to leave the house and struggle with crippling anxiety. The reality of ADHD isn't fun or cute. It often leaves people feeling overwhelmed and overstimulated by even the smallest daily tasks. Think about the countless hours spent in therapy, the prescription drugs and sometimes hospitalizations some people endure to manage their mental illness. When we romanticize mental illness, we undermine the seriousness of certain mental conditions. The public has become very familiar with mental health vocabulary and symptoms, which, on the one hand, helps with early diagnosis and encourages people to seek help, but on the other hand, this familiarity has given everyone a false sense of authority about the topic. People start to diagnose not just themselves, but their followers, and labeling and categorizing human behavior might explain why you act the way you do. And that's not satisfying. It takes away the mystery behind your quirks or life struggles. But when it's not done under the supervision of a healthcare provider, it can lead to serious issues. We've learned not to Google our symptoms when we have physical health issues because it just says you have cancer. So why do we do the same when we have mental health issues? Look at the online discourse and see how blurred the line between mental health and mental illness is. Like physical health, mental health is something everyone must maintain, but just because you struggle with your mental health doesn't mean you're mentally ill. Conflating the two minimizes the suffering someone with a diagnosed mental illness has to go through daily. Romanticizing mental illness is a misrepresentation of the whole story. It's best to maintain a neutral stance when engaging with that topic. Try being the key word here. Because the truth is, mental illness will always be complicated and messy. It changes human behavior, and productive conversations do not compartmentalize neatly, which is why, to an extent, romanticization might be inevitable. It's human nature to spin a situation to be more desirable or attractive. In knowing this, how do we reset our mindset when influenced to maintain some neutral stance when discussing mental health? Well, first, you must give yourself a reality check on what mental illness means and how it affects people. It's not always just manically cleaning the house. It's ugly, gritty, and gets in the way of relationships. It's not cute, quirky, or fun. It genuinely destroys lives. Remind yourself that it's unethical to appropriate the aesthetics of mental illness for this reason, wearing the mask without understanding the pain hidden beneath it. Recognize that most aspects of people's mental health journey remains private. Behind closed doors, you don't know people's struggles. So it's crucial to delve into the nuances and complexities of dealing with mental illnesses and steer clear of an overly romantic outlook. Then and only then can you flirt with romanticism occasionally, instead of using it as a lens through which to interpret mental illness as a whole. You wake up in the morning, head outside, and you say good morning to your next door neighbor. You walk down the street and you see a familiar face, so you nod to them to let them know that you acknowledge them. You get into a bus and an old lady walks in behind you, so you stand up and let her take your seat. You're not compelled to do any of these things. There are no moral handbooks or guides that give us a checklist of the world's do's and don'ts. It's not in any constitution or any written rulebook. But somehow, we all know these rules. We strictly abide by them. We don't tell each other what they are,
but we all know when someone breaks them. These are the unspoken rules of society. Aristotle once said, "Man is by nature a social animal. An individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally is either beneath our notice or more than human." Because we're such social animals, we depend on one another for everything, including sometimes determining what is right and what's wrong. We come together to make seats of government, appoint leaders to keep things in check, and we write ourselves a constitution. But that's for the big stuff. For the little things that we are more likely to face every day, there are no rules or constitutional demands, just a common understanding among all of us on what is right and what is wrong. But we don't always get it right. As a society, we love to look at pictures. It reminds us of a time that once was. It makes us feel nostalgic. And when we share these pictures with people, it gives them a sneak peek into our lives, where we were, how far we've come, and all the things we've been through along the way. Before smartphones, we'd all keep large family photo albums in our house for when a guest comes over, and occasionally, as they sat, we'd hand it over to them and bond over the memories of the past. Now we still do that today, just in a different way. We often send pictures to one another from our smartphones, post throwback photos on social media, and simply just hand our phones to people to see a certain picture. But then, they start swiping left or right to see more pictures, so we get angry. But why? Because they've just broken an unspoken rule. Don't swipe left or right if someone shows you a photo on their phone, unless they tell you it's okay to do so. Because unlike our family photo albums that are carefully curated to show the pictures we're comfortable with others seeing, our phones have everything from funny memes we want to share to private photos that should never be seen by anyone else. This is why it's important to restrict yourself to as much information as the other person is willing to share. It's amazing when you think about it, but smartphones are a very recent invention. The very first commercial smartphone was released around 30 years ago, but it wasn't until 2007, with the release of the iPhone, that phones truly became smart by modern standards. And in such a short period of time, as a society, we've been able to create unspoken rules around using the smartphone that somehow we all just seem to follow. Before phones were invented, we always had to visit each other unannounced, but since phones came around and texting became a thing, we created a new unspoken rule. You don't normally go to people's houses without texting or calling them to let them know. Of course, this often exempts family members and very close friends, but if you just want to stop by the house of your coworker or someone you're not really close to, you should probably send them a text first, or you won't be greeted by a smiling face when you ring the doorbell. As humans, we communicate not with just our words, but also with our actions. In fact, as the saying goes, actions speak louder than words. When we speak to each other, we're watching for hand gestures, hand movements, proximity, we're watching for body language. Oftentimes, this helps us know exactly how we're doing in a conversation. Does the person seem interested? Do they look confused? All of that. This is why it's considered rude to look down at your phone screen when someone's talking to you, even if you're listening to them with utmost concentration. People want to be able to look you in the eyes when they're talking to you. In the same vein, it's also considered rude to leave your earbuds in your ear while you're talking to people. This has become even more important since wireless earbuds became a thing. Because they're so tiny and comfortable, it's easy to leave them in your ears, even when you're talking to people. But as a society, we've come together to say that it's much more respectful to take the earbuds out so people don't think they have to shout at you to hear them. People on public transport often have no respect for personal space. And honestly, most times it's not really their fault. There's just very little room for everyone to share. We've learned to understand these things. But still, there are boundaries you must not cross. No matter how close you have to be to someone else, just don't look at their phone. Like I already alluded to earlier, phones usually contain really private and sensitive information, some of which you really might not want to see, and peeping into someone else's phone is a sure way to witness the unforgettable. Speaking of smartphones in public transportation, there is one unspoken rule I wish more people would follow. Don't play music out of your speakers in a small public place, like in a waiting room or on a bus. No matter how amazing you think that song is, not everyone's gonna like it. And even if everyone does, some people might have just had a rough day and just want to sit in silence to take a break and recollect their thoughts. We should give them the opportunity to do this. If you want to listen to music on your commute, get a pair of wireless earbuds. They're pretty cheap. Similarly, don't take personal calls in public is another really popular unspoken rule. Unless it's an emergency, no one really wants to hear the conversation you're having with your long-lost second cousin or all the office gossip your coworker is giving you. And if you must take the call, it's best you find somewhere even moderately private or reduce your voice to the bare minimum to avoid getting dirty looks from the people around you. When someone whispers something to you, it's an unspoken rule to whisper or reply back to them, because more often than not, they're whispering because they don't want anyone else hearing in on your conversation. As humans, we tell a lot of lies. Sometimes we lie to make ourselves feel better, sometimes we lie to protect other people's feelings, sometimes we lie to impress people, sometimes to fit better in certain social spaces, and sometimes we just want to get some time off work. Whatever the reason might be for you, the truth is we lie a lot. And for the most part, we've accepted this as a society. However, as a rule, there are two people you never lie to, your doctor and your lawyer. Thankfully, these two people are also required by law to take your truths to the grave, so you don't have to worry about your secrets getting exposed. To prevent people from lying unnecessarily just to save face, there are also some questions we just don't ask. You normally never ask how much they earn, how much they weigh, and you never ask a woman her age. Why that is, I'm still not so sure. If you're close enough to people, you'll most likely know all of these details without asking. And if you're not close enough to them to know, then you're not close enough to be asking either. It's important to say it again that humans are very social animals. This means that we thrive in groups. As a result, we have learned to be kind to one another. It creates a sense of camaraderie and helps us build and strengthen our communities. So, to make it easier for everyone, we created unspoken rules to help us determine what is kind, what is nice, and what is not. If you had an arrangement to meet up with someone, and for some reason you had to cancel, it's your job to reschedule. When you do this, you let the person know that you value their time, and you're willing to make things right for not fulfilling your end of the bargain previously. If someone offers to share food with you, they get to have the first and the last pieces. And if they have just one piece left, it's only courteous that you don't ask them for that thing at all. Being kind doesn't always mean cheering people on. Sometimes, it's pointing out flaws and helping to fix them whenever we can. However, as an unspoken rule, you should only point out flaws that can be fixed in 30 seconds or less. You're having lunch with your friend and there's something on his teeth. Tell him. Your girlfriend's shirt got untucked in the back. Let her know. But things like her makeup or his poor combination of clothes, there's no need to point it out if they can't immediately do anything about it. You'll only make them insecure and self-conscious. There are two places you should never make fuss or start drama: a wedding and at a funeral. Weddings are really special and sacred to most people and in most cultures around the world, so ruining one is heavily frowned upon in our society. Don't try to propose at someone else's wedding, please, unless they offer. Do not ask them, because then you put them in a weird position where it's difficult for them to say no, especially if you're close friends. Don't make their lives harder than they need to be. At funerals, you should have respect for the dead. Let people pay their final respects to their deceased loved ones. You can meet the living relatives much later to demand whatever it is they owe. As children, we didn't really see any of these unspoken rules because not much was expected of us at the time. Yes, we might have been taught to be kind to strangers and respectful to our elders, but generally, we were also easily forgiven if we ever broke any unspoken rule. But it's not the same for adults. In fact, the older we get, the more rules get added to what we already have to follow. As a child, leaving a shopping cart in the middle of the grocery aisle could be considered cute, but as an adult, you won't be forgiven so easily. As you get older, people will also be less keen to borrow your things. They bought their stuff with their own money and they expect you to do the same. So as a general unspoken rule, you never borrow stuff more than twice. If you're borrowing it for a third time, then you clearly need one of your own. When you start living on your own, you have to get important things like your furniture, kitchen utensils, and bathroom appliances. However, one thing you must never forget is a plunger. And this is one of the only unspoken rules that's for personal benefit alone. You should always buy a plunger before you need a plunger. On your first day at a new job, you're usually told how things work at the organization. You're given a set of duties and responsibilities, and you're educated on the culture of that office. Things you're allowed to do, and things you're not allowed to do. However, there are a few things they don't include in the orientation speech, like don't cook fish or anything that has the potential to smell terrible in the office kitchen. Be kind to the less skilled staff, like the janitors and security guards, and wait until everyone has gotten off the elevator before you get on. It's rules like these that bind us together as a society. If everyone and everything was put in a constitution, we would be living like robots. But I mean, we basically already are. By leaving many of these rules unspoken, we're able to follow them more naturally, because some things are better left unsaid.
As autumn settles in, leaves fall from the trees and another growing season ends with the harvest. This might not have been a great year for crops, but winter will destroy the evidence of last year's efforts and present a new opportunity for growth, a fresh start. Near the end of the year, you might find your home is in disarray. Your cabinets and fridge are overflowing, yet there's nothing to eat. Your desk is a mess of papers, notices, and cables, yet you struggle to finish any of your projects. Maybe you're feeling out of shape or starting to reflect on past relationships. You think you should know more than you do. You've barely seen the world, and the clock is ticking. A feeling of despair settles in, but also a desire for change and a sense of renewed hope. The clock strikes midnight. It's the new year, the perfect opportunity for a fresh start. You feel inspired to make a resolution or two, take steps to improve your life. You could resolve to get in shape or eat better. Maybe you'll plan to master a new language this year or learn how to code. The new year fills you with hope and you feel like anything is possible. Like everything is possible. But then despair sinks in yet again, and you know from past experiences that you're not great at keeping New Year's resolutions. Most people aren't. In fact, 90% of New Year's resolutions are abandoned in the first 3 months. Your neat cabinets become cluttered again, and that effort to learn a new language is swiftly forgotten. Adios. It makes you wonder, is there a reliable way to keep our resolutions, or is this annual concept of a fresh start unsound to begin with? For all we know, humans have been making resolutions for at least 4,000 years. The first known New Year's celebrations and resolutions were documented in the ancient civilization of Babylon. These resolutions revolved around the growing season, with the new year starting in the spring. They were an intertwining of religion and mythology with socio-economic values and power. After parading statues of their deities through the city streets, Babylonians would enact religious ceremonies to symbolize their victory over chaos. In addition to planting crops, people would pledge allegiance to the reigning king. But celebrations also involved a practical promise to repay debts in the next year. As a reward, they believed the gods would look favorably upon them. Similar traditions continued in ancient Rome, with New Year's pledges and sacrifices. The start date shifted when Emperor Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 46 BCE, which moved the start of the new year to January 1st. In the Middle Ages, medieval knights pledged allegiance and renewed their vows of chivalry and valor. For thousands of years, we've been making these resolutions and failing to meet them. But why? Why is it that most New Year's resolutions go unfulfilled? Why does hope fade into despair? Well, many resolutions fail because of what psychologists call false hope syndrome. We make unreasonable goals with high hopes of achieving them. Then, when we're unable to reach these lofty targets, we get distraught. This leads to a lasting despair. We lose hope in the belief that we can make meaningful changes in our lives. This is the problem with inspiring stories of change we see online or on TV. They fill us with confidence but leave us without a concrete path towards change. They give us a North Star but no navigation skills. Sticking to a resolution requires us to be grounded in a state where we don't think change is easy, but where we still believe it's possible. Many of us don't think in this dichotomy, inevitably leading to failure. Another problem many of us have is that our goals are often too large and ambiguous. We make resolutions like I want to be healthy and I want to learn a new language, but we don't make a plan on how we plan to achieve those things. When considering learning a new language, for example, set a specific goal, like signing up and finishing a language course. When you commit to a process over an outcome, you avoid being overwhelmed by what constitutes a successful resolution. Completing the course is straightforward and achievable, whereas learning a new language is a vague statement and can easily make you feel defeated. On TikTok this past New Year's, resolutions took on a different form. Influencers posted ins and outs lists on their feeds. The ins list included things like good habits, maybe being punctual. On the outs list were things like fast fashion and other consumer habits believed to cause harm. These lists often featured more specifics than your average lofty resolution, but lacked tangible steps to achieve them.
If you want to avoid fast fashion, what are you going to replace it with? Will you buy fewer clothes and spend more on local clothing? Will you buy more used clothes? These are the kind of steps that need to be considered first. The problem with the outs list is that they try to erase behavior, which rarely works. If you rephrase your outs list with an ins list, you focus on what you're replacing the outs with. If you want to stop sitting in a chair for hours on end, don't try to stop sitting in a chair for hours. Focus on building a habit that will replace that instead. Like maybe you commit to doing stretches every hour or trying to do some mental work during a walk. Another problem that these videos and resolutions in general create is that they often lack a good reason. Why are you choosing this resolution? Is it something you want deep down, or is it just a fleeting consideration? Pursuing a goal almost always requires making yourself uncomfortable in some way. Losing weight means eating less of the food you crave and exercising more, and if you don't sincerely want your goal, will you really be willing to make yourself uncomfortable to achieve it? Often we impulsively choose our resolutions or ins and outs for the year, but when it comes to making sacrifices to achieve them, our ambition shrinks. We realize that our desire for that specific change was fleeting. In psychology, there's what's called the fresh start effect, and it's simply the effect of fresh starts on task performance. In a study, researchers found that fresh starts were helpful in areas where people were underperforming. But oddly, the places where people already excelled were actually worsened by a fresh start. When picking a resolution, you want to address a deficiency and not just chase a trend. Otherwise, your fresh start won't have a positive impact. And if you don't feel strongly about making a resolution, try thinking about the notion of a fresh start. What in your life would you like to reset, like the yearly harvest? There must be something in the back of your mind that hangs over your life like a dark cloud. Zero in on that desire for a fresh start to find something you genuinely want to change in your life. Once your plans for change are narrowed down, you need to ask yourself an important question. Are you ready for it? Before people are psychologically prepared to change, they usually go through stages: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. Successful resolutions are typically made when people are already in the action phase of change. So when considering resolutions, it makes sense then to avoid plans that you have barely considered. You should be so far along with your desire for change that you'd likely have done it anyway. You may think this would make the New Year's resolution pointless, but that's not true. While it is good to make a change any time of year, the new year presents an excellent opportunity to reinforce your plans for change. There's extra incentive to stick to a New Year's resolution. It's a promise to yourself with bigger stakes. And even better, if you share your resolution with someone, you have a witness to hold you to your promise. That's external pressure to stick to your plans for change. You can even ask them to hold you to task over it, depending on how serious you want to get. Real change is achieved incrementally, with the steps clearly laid out. Clarity of how to achieve your goal along with the deep desire to fulfill it is crucial. Your steps need to be laid out on a timeline, and they need to be measurable and achievable. Don't be afraid of support either. In a New Year's resolution study, the most successful resolution makers had support in achieving their goals. This can mean a variety of things. Quitting bad habits might mean asking for help from someone who's done it before. You could talk to a therapist or an instructor about your plan. Ultimately, you need desire and clarity in your New Year's resolution. You need to want to change and have clarity on the steps you need to take. The two most significant obstacles to real change are a lack of will and ambiguity. As most professionals in any field will tell you, it's critical to trust the process. Make the process about changing your focus rather than about the change itself. Otherwise, you're just engaging in fantasy. To truly change is to change habits. When we give up on a resolution, we're giving up our new habit before it can be set in stone. Our specific resolution to finish a language course probably wouldn't end there. If the habit becomes ingrained, then you'll likely pursue learning further, whether that means taking more courses or just trying to use your new language among native speakers. Change itself can become a habit, leading to a more consistent pursuit of a better life. That's a life with less forgotten goals weighing us down, a life where we can confidently look ahead without regretting our neglected dreams. Everyone will experience lapses on the road to achieving the resolution, and it's important not to judge yourself harshly for any missteps. This can result in quitting needlessly, and there's no point in sinking back into despair. Real change is possible. It happens all the time, but it rarely comes easy. Watch this video next to understand how to build long-lasting habits.
To be alone forever. Some people's greatest fear. A table for one at a fancy restaurant, falling asleep in a cold bed,